A woman hired me to play her shameful, penniless fiancé so that her family, horrified by the loser she'd supposedly chosen, would gratefully bless her marriage to the real groom, the heir of House Thorn. I took the job for $2,000 and a free suit that didn't fit. At the wedding, the real groom turned to look at the pathetic stand-in he was about to replace, and the blood drained from his face, and Julian Thorn, heir to one of the 5 great houses of this city, dropped to one knee in front of 300 guests. Because in Julian Thorn's world, you kneel before exactly one man. And that man had just shown up to the wedding wearing a suit that didn't fit, holding a cheap bouquet, hired help, the shameful fake fiancé, the loser the bride was so eager to be rid of. Me. Let me back all the way up, because the look on Julian Thorn's face when he recognized me is the single finest thing I have witnessed in years, and a thing that good deserves to be earned, not handed over. To understand why the heir of House Thorn dropped to his knee in front of his own wedding, you have to understand who I actually am. And to understand why I was standing there in a cheap suit playing a hired loser, you have to understand how spectacularly bored a man can become when he has all the power in the world and nothing left that anyone will say no to. My name is Leo Sterling, and in this city there are 5 great houses, ancient dynasties of wealth and influence that own the banks and the towers and the courts and, in most ways that matter, the people. Thorn is one of them. Vance, my bride's family, used to be one of them before they fell. And the 5 great houses, for all their power, for all their pride, for all the way the heirs like Julian Thorn swagger through this city as if they own the air, all 5 of them answer to something above them. There is a council older than any of the houses, a body that the founders of this city created to keep the great families from devouring each other and the city with them. An apex authority that sits above all 5 houses and to which every patriarch, every heir, every proud dynasty ultimately bends the knee. They call it the Founders' Court, and the court has one head, one final authority, one seat from which the entire structure of power in this city is, in the last analysis, governed. I sit in that seat. I am the sovereign of the Founders' Court. Every patriarch of every great house has knelt to me, sworn to me, answered to me. Julian Thorn's own father, Arthur Thorn, the lion of House Thorn, the man who terrifies this entire city, has knelt on the floor of the court and pledged his house's loyalty to me with his forehead nearly touching the stone. The 5 great houses think they rule this city. They're wrong. They rule it the way a regional governor rules a province, with real power and real swagger and a real boot on the necks of everyone below them, and with one knee that bends always when the throne above them calls. I am the throne above them. I am the one knee that every proud heir in this city keeps in reserve for the one man, the only man, they will ever kneel to. And almost none of them have ever seen my face. That's the part that made the wedding possible, the part that made the whole absurd, magnificent thing work. The sovereign of the Founders' Court rules from behind a veil, the way the court has always been ruled, through intermediaries and sealed decrees and a deliberate cultivated invisibility, because the founders understood, centuries ago, that an apex authority everyone can see is an apex authority everyone can scheme against, and an apex authority no one can see is a god. So the heirs of the great houses grow up knowing the sovereign exists, knowing the court rules them, knowing that somewhere there is one man they would kneel to, and almost none of them ever lay eyes on him, because they deal with the court through its officers, its seals, its rituals, and the man at the center stays a rumor, a presence, a thing felt rather than seen. I inherited the seat young, younger than any sovereign before me, 3 years ago, and I will tell you honestly that it nearly drove me out of my mind. Picture it. 29 years old, handed the most absolute power in the city, a power so complete that no one, anywhere, will ever again tell you the truth or deny you anything or treat you as a human being rather than a force of nature. Every room I entered, if they knew who I was, dissolved into terror and flattery. Every word I spoke was treated as law. Every person I met wanted something, feared something, performed something. I had everything, and in having everything I had lost the one thing that makes a life worth living, which is the experience of being an ordinary person among ordinary people, seen for yourself rather than for your throne. told no, told the truth, allowed to be a man instead of a god. I had won the entire game before I was 30, and the prize for winning the game, it turns out, is that the game stops being playable, and you are left holding all the chips at a table where no one will ever bet against you again. So I did what bored gods have always done. I went among the mortals in disguise. It started small. I'd slip the court, shed the sovereign, put on ordinary clothes, and walk through the city as no one, as a man named Leo with no surname that mattered. And I'd sit in cheap diners and ride crowded trains and let people be rude to me and honest with me and utterly indifferent to me. And it was the closest thing to peace I'd felt since I took the seat. Being no one was the only luxury my absolute power couldn't buy, and the only one I actually wanted. My officers thought it was reckless, the sovereign wandering the city unguarded as a commoner, and it was. And I didn't care, because a god who can't occasionally be a man isn't powerful, he's imprisoned, and I'd had enough of the prison. And one evening, in that ordinary life, scrolling the kind of gig listings that ordinary people without my resources actually use to make rent, more out of anthropological curiosity than anything, I found the advertisement that became this entire story. It was discreet, oddly worded, clearly written by someone trying to describe something humiliating without quite saying it. Seeking a man, 25 to 35, to perform a short-term role at private family events. Must be willing to appear unsuccessful, unrefined, financially struggling. Acting experience helpful. Discretion essential. $2,000 plus wardrobe. And something about the strange specificity of it. The request for a man willing to appear unsuccessful, willing to play the loser, caught me. The sovereign of the founder's court, the most successful man in the city, and made me laugh out loud in a cheap diner. Because here was the universe offering me the one role I could never play in my real life, the one experience my throne forbade. To be, for $2,000, the loser, the failure, the man everyone looks down on, the exact opposite of everything I was condemned to be. I answered the ad. Of course I answered the ad. A bored god offered the chance to play the lowest mortal in the room could no more resist it than a starving man could resist bread. The woman who'd placed it met me in a quiet cafe, and her name was Ilara Vance, and I knew the name the instant she said it, because Vance is one of the 5 great houses, or was, the fallen one, and the sovereign of the founder's court knows the name of every house and every heir, even when they don't know his face. So I sat across from an heir of a great house, a woman who would have knelt to me if she'd had any idea who I was, and she looked at me, an ordinary, unremarkable man named Leo, and she explained, with the particular shame of a person describing a scheme they're not proud of, exactly what she needed me to do. I need a fake fiancé, she said, a bad one, the worst one. I need you to come to my family's events over the next few weeks, and I need you to be poor, and awkward, and unsuccessful, and embarrassing, and I need my family to be absolutely horrified that I've chosen you. And then, once they're horrified, once they've fully understood that you are what I'll settle for if they don't approve of my real choice, my real fiancé will come forward, and by comparison he'll look like salvation, and my family will bless the marriage they've been refusing to bless out of sheer relief that I'm not marrying you. She had the grace to look ashamed. It's a terrible thing to ask a person to do, to volunteer to be looked down on. I know that. That's why it pays what it pays, and why I'll be kind to you the whole time, in private, even while my family is being cruel to you in public. Because none of it is real, and you'll have done me the biggest favor of my life. Will you do it? Will you be my shameful fiancé? And I, Leo Sterling, the sovereign of the founder's court, the man every patriarch in this city kneels to, looked at this fallen heiress asking me to play a loser so she could marry the man she loved. And I felt 3 things at once. I felt amusement, vast and genuine, at the cosmic joke of it, the most powerful man in the city being hired to play its most pathetic. I felt curiosity, because there was a story here, a real one, a fallen house and a desperate scheme, and a marriage worth this much shame to secure. And I felt, underneath those, a small, unexpected thing, a flicker of something at the way she'd said, I'll be kind to you the whole time, in private, the way she'd been ashamed to ask me to be humiliated, the way she'd thought, even in her own scheme, about the dignity of the hired loser she was about to parade. It was a small thing. It was, I would learn, the truest thing about Alara Vance, and the thing that turned a bored god's amusing diversion into the only thing in 3 years I'd actually cared about. "Yes," I said, "I'll be your shameful fiancé." And I almost added, "And you have no idea, Miss Vance, what you've just hired." But I didn't, because the whole pleasure was that she had no idea, and the pleasure of being no one was the only pleasure I had left. And I intended to enjoy every minute of being the worst man in every room I entered. "When do we start? And how poor exactly do you need me to be? I want to get the costume right." Alara Vance smiled, relieved, grateful, and just slightly guilty, and she said, "As poor as you can stand to seem. My family is going to be horrible to you. I'm so sorry in advance." And I smiled back, the most powerful man in the city accepting a job as its most pathetic. And I thought, "Miss Vance, your family being horrible to me is the most fun I've had in 3 years. Please, be my guest." And I said, "Don't apologize. Honestly, I think I'm going to enjoy this more than you can possibly imagine." I had no idea sitting in that cafe how completely true that would turn out to be, or how the bored god's diversion would become the wedding where a great house knelt and a fallen heiress learned exactly who she'd hired, or that I would fall, hard and genuinely and for the first time in my gilded, imprisoned life, for a woman who'd hired me to be a loser and then been kind to the loser when she thought no one who mattered was watching. But that's the whole story, and we're getting to it. For now, just hold the image. The sovereign of the Founder's Court, in a suit that didn't fit, accepting $2,000 to be paraded as the shameful fiancé, walking into the world of House Thorne and House Vance as no one at all, with every great house in the city about to discover, at a wedding, that the loser they were looking down on was the one man they all knelt to. The kneel was coming. But first I had a family to horrify, a bride to protect, a snake to expose, and the most entertaining few weeks of my life to live, as the worst man in every room, secretly the most powerful man in the city, hired help, the shameful fiancé, a god slumming it in a suit that didn't fit, and loving every single second. The first event was a Vance family dinner, and I prepared for it the way a method actor prepares for the role of a lifetime, because in a sense, it was. I had the wardrobe Alara provided, a cheap suit a size too large in the shoulders and short in the sleeves, the kind of suit that says trying and failing, and I added my own touches, scuffed shoes, a haircut slightly too long, the posture of a man who apologizes for taking up space. I, who had spent 3 years being unable to enter a room without it falling silent in terror, was about to enter a room and be looked down on. And I will tell you that I prepared for it with more genuine joy than I'd brought to anything since I took the throne. There is a specific freedom in being permitted to be the lowest person in the room. No one performs for the lowest person. No one fears the lowest person. The lowest person gets to see everyone exactly as they are, because no one bothers to hide from a man they've already dismissed. I was about to get the clearest view of House Vance and House Thorne that anyone outside those families had ever gotten. And I was going to get it because they'd all decided I didn't matter, which is the exact condition, I'd learned long ago, under which people show you the truth. Alara met me outside the Vance house before the dinner, liable, and she did something then that told me more about her than the next 3 weeks of observation would. She straightened my ill-fitting collar, a small unconscious gesture of care, and she said, "I want to say it one more time before we go in, because once we're inside I have to be cold to you and I hate it. None of what they say in there is real. None of what I say in there is real. You're doing me an enormous kindness, and I see you, even when I'm pretending not to. Whatever they call you in there, whatever I let them think, I want you to know that out here right now, I'm grateful, and I think you're a good man for agreeing to be looked down on to help a stranger." She paused. "And Leo, if at any point it's too much, if they're too cruel, you can leave, and I'll still pay you everything, and I'll never think less of you. Your dignity matters to me more than my scheme does. I need you to know that going in. I have been flattered by the most powerful people in the city. I have had patriarchs of great houses choose their words to me with the care of men diffusing bombs. And I will tell you that nothing anyone has said to me as the sovereign ever landed the way that landed. This fallen heiress, who needed my humiliation to save her marriage, telling the hired loser that his dignity mattered more than her scheme, before a single dollar had changed hands, when she had every incentive to simply use me and nothing to gain from the kindness. Because that's the thing, isn't it? The thing I'd built my whole reed of people around. She didn't know I was watching. She thought she was talking to a poor man she'd hired. There was no one to perform for, no advantage to gain, no throne to flatter. There was just a woman who, even while scheming to use a stranger's shame, couldn't stop herself from protecting his dignity, because protecting people's dignity was simply who she was when she thought it didn't count. I'd come to House Vance to be entertained. In the first 90 seconds outside the door, I'd been disarmed, and I didn't even fully realize it yet. "It won't be too much," I said. "Be as cold as you need to be. I promise you I can take whatever your family dishes out and more." And she smiled, not knowing how true that was, and we went in, the fallen heiress and the man every house in the city would kneel to begin the great humiliation of the sovereign of the founder's court by his own delighted design. The Vance family was assembled in a dining room that told the whole story of a fallen house. Grand bones and faded everything, the furniture good but old, the silver polished but thinning, the unmistakable atmosphere of a family clinging to a dignity their bank account no longer supported. There was Evelyn Vance, Ilara's mother, elegant and tired and watchful. There was Edward Vance, Ilara's uncle, the de facto head of the house since the death of Ilara's father, a proud, rigid man who carried the family's decline like a personal insult. And there were various cousins and relations, the whole faded court of a faded house, gathered to meet with visible dread the man Ilara had announced she intended to marry. I will not pretend I didn't enjoy the entrance. Ilara introduced me, and I watched the room's hope die, watched them take in the ill-fitting suit and the scuffed shoes and the apologetic posture, watched Edward Vance's face curdle into the specific contempt a proud poor man reserves for someone he's decided is beneath even his diminished station. And I leaned in. I shook hands too eagerly. I complimented the faded furniture in a way that drew attention to its fadedness. I mentioned with cheerful, oblivious pride my job, which Ilara and I had agreed would be something modest and slightly embarrassing, and I talked about it too much. I was, in short, magnificent, the perfect catastrophe, a man so visibly wrong for an heiress of even a fallen great house that the family's horror deepened with every word I spoke, and across the table Ilara played her part, defending me too weakly, looking embarrassed, letting the family see exactly the scenario she needed them to see, her settling for a disaster. And the whole time, under the performance, I was doing the thing I'd actually come to do, the thing my whole life had trained me for, which was watch. Because a man everyone has dismissed sees everything, and I was seeing House Vance with perfect clarity, and what I saw was not what Ilara's scheme assumed. What I saw was a family that wasn't snobbish about me because they were cruel. They were snobbish about me because they were terrified. House Vance was drowning. I could read it in everything, the strain under Evelyn's elegance, the desperation under Edward's pride, the particular fear of a great family that has fallen far enough to see the bottom rushing up. And their horror at me wasn't really about me. It was about what I represented to them, the final confirmation of their fall, an heiress of House Vance reduced to marrying a nobody. They weren't villains looking down on a poor man for sport. They were frightened people watching the last of their status slip away, and Ilara's fake loser was the embodiment of their deepest fear. And the second thing I saw, the thing that made me set down my fork and pay very close attention, was that the Vance family's terror had a specific cause, a recent one, a wound. Edward Vance, deep in the dinner, made a bitter comment about how the family wouldn't be in this position if not for the collapse of the Vance Foundry, the family's last real asset, the company that had been House Vance's foundation for a century, which had failed, suddenly and catastrophically, 2 years before. And the way Edward said it, the specific bitterness, the half-swallowed word sabotage that he caught himself before fully saying, told me that the collapse of the Vance Foundry was not the ordinary failure the family told the world it was. Something had happened to the Vance Foundry. Someone had happened to it. And the fall of House Vance, the desperation that had Ilara scheming to marry into a richer house, the whole tragedy of this faded family, traced back to the suspicious, sudden, never fully explained death of their last great asset. I filed it away, the way I file everything, behind the apologetic smile of the shameful fiancé. The Vance Foundry. Sabotage. A great house brought low by something that wasn't bad luck. And a daughter of that house now scheming to marry into House Thorn, the rich, ruthless, ascending house, to save what was left. House Thorn. The name sat in my mind with a particular weight, because House Thorn was on my radar, had been for months, in my real life, the life behind the veil. Of the 5 great houses, House Thorn was the one the Founders Court had been quietly watching, because House Thorn, under Arthur Thorn, had been overreaching, accumulating, pushing at the boundaries the court existed to enforce, behaving, in short, like a house that had begun to imagine it might not need to kneel forever. I had not yet decided what to do about House Thorn's ambitions. And now, by the universe's strange arrangement, I was sitting in a fallen house's dining room, hired to grease the marriage of that fallen house's heiress to the heir of the exact house the court was watching, in a union that would absorb whatever was left of House Vance into the ascending, overreaching, court-defying House Thorn. The pieces were assembling into a shape I didn't like, and the shape was this. House Thorn, ambitious and ruthless and reaching for more than its station, marrying its heir to the heiress of a fallen house, a house that had fallen suspiciously, a house whose last great asset had collapsed in a way its own family half believed was sabotage. And the bride, sweet, kind, desperate Elara, who protected the dignity of a hired loser before she'd paid him a dime, scheming with all her heart to secure a marriage to the heir of the house that might well have engineered her own family's fall. I didn't know that yet, not for certain. But sitting at that dinner, the dismissed loser watching everything because no one bothered to hide from him, I felt the certainty begin to form, the cold, clear certainty I'd learned to trust, that Elara Vance was not the schemer in this story. She was the mark, and the marriage she was working so hard, shaming herself and a hired stranger to bring about, was not her salvation. It was the final move in someone else's much longer, much colder scheme. After the dinner, outside in the dark, Elara walked me to the gate, and she was lit up with relief and guilt. Because the performance had worked, her family was horrified, the plan was on track. "You were perfect," she said. "Awful, perfectly awful. They're going to be so relieved when Julian steps forward that they'll bless it on the spot. I'm sorry they were so cold to you, Uncle Edward especially. He's not a bad man, he's just... We've lost so much, and he feels it as a failure. And you, I'm sorry, you became the symbol of everything he's afraid of." She pressed an envelope into my hand, the first payment, and she said, "Thank you, Leo, truly. You're saving my whole family. Once I marry Julian, the Crowtons will help us, they've promised. House Vance will be safe. My mother won't have to worry. My uncle can stop carrying this weight. You're the one making it possible. I'll never be able to thank you enough." And I looked at Elara Vance, glowing with gratitude and hope, certain she was securing her family's salvation, and I felt, for the first time in 3 years, something I'd thought my throne had killed, the urge to protect someone. Not as the sovereign with decrees and power, as a man, as Leo, the hired loser who had just realized that the woman who'd hired him to be shamed was walking with her whole hopeful heart into a trap, and who could not, would not, let her walk into it, even though she had no idea that the poor man she was thanking was the one person in the city with the power to burn the trap to the ground. "Elara," I said carefully, the first time I'd used her first name. "Can I ask you something, as your fake fiancé with no agenda? How sure are you really that Julian Thorn loves you? And how sure are you that his family's promise to save yours is real?" I watched a flicker of something cross her face, a doubt she'd been suppressing, and I gentled my voice. "I'm no one. I'm hired help in a bad suit. But I've watched a lot of people in a lot of rooms, more than you'd guess, and I've learned to see things. And before you do something this big, I'd want someone to ask you those questions. So I'm asking, are you sure?" Elara was quiet for a long moment, the hope dimming just slightly into something more honest, and she said softly, "No, I'm not sure. I tell myself I am. But sometimes when Julian thinks I'm not looking, there's something in his face that I tell myself I'm imagining it." She shook her head, pushing the doubt back down. "But it doesn't matter, does it? My family needs this. Even if Julian and I aren't a great love, even if it's partly arrangement, marriages in our world always are. The Crowtons save my family. That's enough. That has to be enough. She gave me a small, sad smile. It's sweet of you to ask, Leo. No one's asked me that. Everyone just wants the marriage to happen. My family for the rescue, the Crowtons for, well, whatever they want from it. You're the only one who asked if I was sure. The hired loser in the bad suit, the only one who asked. She turned to go, then paused. Maybe that's why I trust you, even though I just hired you. You're the only one in this whole thing who seems to actually care whether I'm okay. She went inside, and I stood at the gate of the fallen house in the dark, holding an envelope of money I didn't need, having just been told by the woman I was hired to humiliate that I was the only one who cared whether she was okay, and I made a decision that the sovereign of the Founders Court had no business making over a $2,000 gig, but that the man named Leo couldn't help making. I was going to find out exactly what House Thorn was really doing. I was going to find out what happened to the Vance Foundry. And if the marriage Alara was walking into was the trap I increasingly believed it was, I was going to make sure that the wedding she thought would save her family became instead the day the whole scheme came apart, in front of everyone, at the hands of the hired loser who turned out to be the one man in the city that House Thorn would kneel to. She'd hired a shameful fiancé. She'd accidentally hired the most powerful man in the city and made him care. House Thorn had no idea what was about to walk into their wedding. Honestly, neither did I, not yet. But I knew where to start. I knew how to find out what happened to a fallen house's last great asset. And I knew, with the cold certainty I'd built a life on, that the answer was going to be very bad for House Thorn, and that I was going to enjoy delivering it, at a wedding, in a suit that didn't fit, on my own perfect terms. I want to linger on the performance itself, the actual experience of being the shameful fiancé, because it was, for all the dark scheme underneath it, the most fun I'd had in 3 years, and because in the playing of the loser, I learned things about the great houses, and about Alara, and about myself, that no amount of ruling from behind a veil had ever taught me. There is a craft to being looked down on, and I discovered I had a talent for it. The trick, I learned across those weeks, is not to play poor exactly, but to play a man who doesn't know he's failing, a man cheerfully oblivious to his own wrongness, because that's the version that makes the powerful most uncomfortable, the loser who isn't ashamed of being a loser. So I'd arrive at the Vance and Thorn events radiating an unearned contentment, complimenting the wrong things, misunderstanding the codes, being warmly, obliviously, magnificently out of place. And I'd watch the great houses not know what to do with me, because their contempt was built to crush a man who knew he should be ashamed, and it slid right off a man who was simply, happily, having a nice time at a party he had no business being at. It drove Julian especially mad. He wanted the prop to be visibly pathetic, cringing, aware of his own lowliness, and instead the prop kept enjoying the canapes and admiring the architecture and asking sincere, friendly questions of people who couldn't believe he dared to address them, and Julian couldn't understand why his contempt wasn't landing, because Julian had never met a man who genuinely didn't care what the powerful thought of him, having never been such a man, and never met the only kind of person who can be one, which is a person who has nothing to prove because he's already, secretly, everything. There was an afternoon at a Thorn Garden luncheon, a particularly fine bit of theater, where one of the great house matriarchs, a fearsome old woman named Lady Sinclair, who terrified the entire city, decided to amuse herself by interrogating the shameful fiancé in front of an audience, a public dissection of the loser for the entertainment of the powerful. She asked me, with surgical cruelty, about my prospects, my family, my education, my income, each question designed to expose another dimension of my unworthiness, and the assembled guests leaned in to enjoy the blood sport. And I, the sovereign of the Founders Court, who could have ended Lady Sinclair's house with a sealed decree, answered every question with cheerful, disarming, oblivious honesty, playing the role to perfection, letting her land every blow, until Lady Sinclair, frustrated that the prop wouldn't bleed, that he kept smiling through her cruelty, finally said with open contempt, "I simply cannot fathom what a Vance heiress, fallen as she is, sees in a man of such complete insignificance. You are nothing, young man, nothing at all. I've met more impressive footmen." And I smiled at Lady Sinclair, and I said in the prop's warm, oblivious voice, "You're probably right, my lady. I'm not impressive at all. But I've found that the most impressive people I've ever met spend an awful lot of energy reminding everyone how impressive they are. And the people who actually matter, in my experience, never seem to need to. The kindest person at this whole party knelt on a staff room floor last week to help a server who dropped a tray where no one important could see, and never mentioned it. And that's the most impressive thing I've witnessed in this entire city. So I suppose I'd rather be insignificant and notice things like that than be impressive and miss them. But I'm sure you're right, my lady. I'm sure I'm nothing at all." And I watched Lady Sinclair not quite know what to do with that, because the prop had answered her cruelty with a philosophy, and the philosophy was uncomfortably difficult to dismiss, and several of the guests who'd leaned in for the blood sport were now looking at the loser with a flicker of unease, the unease of people who've just heard a truth they'd have preferred not to hear from a man they'd decided didn't matter. It was a small moment, but it was the first crack, the first time the prop made the powerful uncomfortable, and I filed away Lady Sinclair's face, and I thought, "A year from now, my lady, you'll remember calling me nothing at all, and the remembering will be its own correction." But the performance wasn't only about discomforting the powerful, it was about watching them, and the watching taught me the city in a way the throne never had. Because the great houses, certain the prop didn't matter, conducted themselves in front of me with a frankness they'd never have shown the sovereign, and I learned more about the real character of the 5 great houses in 3 weeks of being dismissed than in 3 years of ruling them from behind a veil. I learned which patriarchs were cruel and which were merely frightened. I learned which heirs had character and which were snakes like Julian. I learned the real alliances and the real grievances and the real rot, all of it displayed openly in front of the loser, because the loser didn't count, because no one performs for a man they've dismissed. It was the most valuable intelligence I'd ever gathered, and I'd gathered it for $2,000 in a bad suit, and it confirmed the thing I'd built my whole approach to power around, that the truth is only ever visible from the bottom, that the powerful show you who they are only when they're certain you don't matter, and that a ruler who can't get to the bottom, who's trapped at the top behind a veil, is a ruler who never sees the truth at all. The gig had started as medicine for my loneliness. It had become the best governing I'd done in 3 years, because for the first time I was seeing my city from the one angle that shows the truth. And the performance taught me Elara, most of all, because I watched her across all those events, in the role of the bride managing her shameful fiancé, and the consistency of her was the most beautiful thing I'd ever observed. Every cruelty her family or the Crowtons directed at the prop, Elara absorbed some of it onto herself, deflected it, softened it, in small, invisible ways, even though the scheme required the prop to be humiliated, even though her own plan depended on it, she couldn't stop herself from protecting the dignity of the man she'd hired to be shamed. She'd refill my glass before a servant could ignore me. She'd draw a cruel relative's attention away when the mockery got too sharp. She'd catch my eye across a room after some humiliation and give me a small, private look of apology and solidarity, the look that said, "I see you, this isn't real. You matter to me even if I have to pretend you don't." She was running a scheme that required my degradation, and she could not, constitutionally, fully degrade me, because degrading people was simply not in her. Not even the people her own plan required her to degrade, and watching a woman be unable to be cruel even when her family's salvation depended on it, was the thing that turned my growing affection into the certainty that I was going to marry her, one way or another, throne or no throne, scheme or no scheme. There was one evening, the loveliest, when the prop was seated at the far end of a long dinner table, in the worst seat, exiled to the social Siberia where embarrassing fiancés belong, and Elara, who was seated in a place of honor near Julian, spent the whole dinner stealing glances down the table at the lonely loser in the bad suit. And at one point, when she thought no one was watching, she had a server carry a small plate of the best dessert down to the prop's exile, with a folded napkin note that said only, in her handwriting, "You're the most interesting person at this table, and I'm sorry you're stuck down there. Save me a dance later, even though we both know we can't." And I sat in my exile with the smuggled dessert and the secret note. The sovereign of the founder's court, happier than any throne had ever made me, because a woman who didn't know who I was had smuggled me dessert and a note across a dinner that required her to disown me, because she couldn't help it, because seeing the lonely and reaching for them was simply who she was. And I thought, I am going to spend the rest of my life with this woman, and I am going to make sure that for every dinner she spent watching me exiled to the far end of a table, she spends 1,000 at the center of every room, honored, cherished, never again exiled by anyone. Because a woman who smuggles dessert to a lonely loser deserves to be the most celebrated person in every room she ever enters. And I have the power to make it so, and I will. That was the performance. The craft of being looked down on, the discomforting of the powerful, the gathering of the truth that only the bottom shows, and, underneath all of it, the slow falling in love with a woman who couldn't be cruel, watched across 100 small moments by a man pretending to be no one, who was secretly everyone, and who had never, in 3 years of absolute power, been as happy as he was eating smuggled dessert in the worst seat at the table, because the woman at the best seat kept looking down the table at him and couldn't stop. I met Julian Thorne at the second event, a garden party at the Vance estate where the families were meant to mingle, and where, according to the plan, the real suitor would begin to emerge as the noble alternative to the shameful fiancé. And meeting Julian Thorne, watching him operate up close, confirmed in about 20 minutes everything my instincts had begun whispering at the dinner. Julian Thorne was a snake, a beautiful, charming, expensively groomed snake, and the only person at that party who couldn't see it was the woman he was about to marry. He was, on the surface, everything Alara's family wanted and everything the contrast required. Tall, polished, effortlessly elegant in the way only old money manages, with a warm, practiced smile and a way of making whoever he spoke to feel briefly like the center of the world. He worked the Vance relatives masterfully, charming Evelyn, impressing Edward, radiating exactly the reassuring competence of a wealthy heir who would save the fallen house. Beside the shameful fiancé in his ill-fitting suit, Julian Thorne looked like salvation made flesh, which was precisely the role the scheme required him to play, and he played it perfectly. But I am a man who learned at the highest possible level to watch how people behave toward those they think don't matter. And Julian Thorne, like everyone, showed me the truth the moment he thought no one important was watching. Because to Julian Thorne, the shameful fiancé was the very definition of someone who didn't matter. And so Julian let me see exactly who he was. It happened at the edge of the party, near the bar, where Julian found himself momentarily alone with me, the hired loser, the embarrassing fiancé he was there to replace. And the charming warm mask he wore for the Lockwoods came off. Entirely, in an instant, the way a mask comes off when there's no one worth wearing it for. And the Julian Thorne underneath looked me up and down with a contempt so pure and so casual that it was almost refreshing. And he said quietly, so only I could hear, "So you're the prop. The desperate little nobody Alara dug up to make me look good. $2,000 to stand here being pathetic, is that it? God, you people will do anything for money." He sipped his drink, smiling his party smile for anyone watching from a distance, while his eyes stands cold on me. "Here's some free advice, prop. Play your part, take your money, and disappear. And don't get any ideas about Alara. She's not for the likes of you. She's barely for the likes of her own family anymore, fallen as far as they have. But she comes with something House Thorne wants, and so I'll marry her, and her sad little family will get their rescue, and you'll go back to whatever gutter you crawled out of, $2,000 richer, having served your purpose." He leaned in, and the mask flickered into something genuinely ugly. "And if you breathe one word to Alara about anything you see or hear, if you do anything other than be the pathetic prop you were hired to be, I'll make sure you regret it. People like you are very easy to ruin. Remember that, prop. Now smile and go be poor somewhere I can't see you." I want you to understand what I felt, standing there in my bad suit, being threatened by Julian Thorne, who had no idea he was speaking to the sovereign of the Founder's court, the man his own father knelt to, the one being in the city who could erase House Thorne with a sealed decree. I felt first the pure, cold clarity of confirmation. She comes with something House Thorne wants. Not love, not even the alliance her family imagined, Something House Thorn wants, something Ilara came with, something worth marrying her for and discarding her family's hopes around. The trap was real, and Julian had just confirmed its shape in a single contemptuous sentence to a man he thought was nobody. And I felt, second, a thing I had not felt in 3 years, a thing my throne had nearly killed in me: anger. Not the cold, strategic displeasure of the sovereign weighing a house's overreach. Hot, human anger on behalf of a kind woman being deceived by a snake, the specific anger of watching someone good be used by someone cruel. Julian Thorne had just called Ilara's family her sad little family, had just confirmed he was marrying her for something she came with, had just threatened the dignity of a hired man and the future of a deceived woman in the same breath, and the man named Leo wanted, very badly, to break Julian Thorne's perfect nose right there at the garden party. The sovereign, of course, did no such thing. The sovereign smiled the pathetic, apologetic smile of the prop and ducked his head and said, "Yes, sir. Of course, sir. I'll stay out of the way," and gave Julian Thorne the satisfaction of having cowed the nobody, because the sovereign had learned long ago that the most dangerous thing you can do to an enemy is let him believe he's won. Let him be fully himself, fully confident, fully committed to the scheme, right up until the moment the floor opens beneath him. Julian Thorne walked away from that exchange certain he'd put the prop in his place, certain the loser was cowed, certain everything was proceeding perfectly. And he'd just handed the prop the confirmation that would end him, and made the prop want to end him, which are two different things that, combined in the right man, are very dangerous indeed. But the moment that truly decided things, the moment that turned my growing certainty into an absolute commitment, came later at that same party, and it involved Ilara, and it's the moment I knew that whatever House Thorne wanted, whatever the scheme was, I was going to burn it down, because of who Ilara was when she didn't know anyone important was watching. I drifted to the staff area the way the hired help does, partly in character and partly because the staff areas are where you learn what's really happening at any great event. And there I found Ilara, the bride-to-be, the heiress, doing something her family and her fiancé would have been baffled by. She was helping a young server who dropped a tray and shattered a stack of expensive glasses, a terrified girl about to be blamed and docked pay and possibly fired. Ilara was on her knees on the staff room floor in her party dress, helping the girl clean up the glass, telling her it was fine, that accidents happen, that she'd handle it with the catering manager so the girl wouldn't be blamed, pressing money into the girl's hand to cover whatever they tried to dock her. All of it quick and quiet and unwitnessed, because Ilara thought no one who mattered was watching, because to Ilara, there was no such thing as a person who didn't matter, because helping a frightened server off a floor full of broken glass was simply what you did, so unremarkable to her that she'd have been embarrassed to be thanked. I stood in the doorway, the hired loser, and I watched the heiress kneel in her party dress to save a server from being blamed for broken glass. And I understood, completely and finally, that Ilara Vance was the realest person I'd encountered in 3 years of being a god among performers, and that she was about to be married, for something she came with, to a snake who'd called her family sad and her dignity disposable. And that I, the sovereign of the Founder's Court, the most powerful man in the city, had been hired by this woman to be humiliated so she could secure that marriage, and that I would sooner abdicate my throne than let it happen. That's the moment I fell, if you want to know. Not a grand romantic moment. A staff room, broken glass, a kind woman on her knees helping someone who could do nothing for her when she thought no one was watching. It's the only kind of moment that ever told me the truth about a person, and it told me the whole truth about Ilara. And the truth was that she was worth burning a great house down for, and that I was going to. She saw me in the doorway and she stood, brushing glass dust off her dress, slightly flustered to be caught, and she said, "Oh, Leo, The poor girl dropped a tray. I was just helping her clean up. Don't tell anyone. My uncle would say it's not appropriate for me to be on the floor with the staff." And I said, "I won't tell anyone, Ilara, but I'll tell you something. That was the kindest thing I've seen anyone do at this entire party, and you did it where no one could see, which is the only place kindness counts." She blushed, waving it off the way the genuinely kind always wave off being seen, and I added, carefully because I decided in that doorway to start the long work of saving her from herself, "Ilara, I need to ask you something, And I need you to really think about it. Not give me the answer your family needs to be true. The man you're marrying, Julian. Have you ever once seen him kneel on a floor to help a server? Have you ever once seen him be kind to someone who couldn't do anything for him? I watched the question land, watched her start to answer automatically and then stop. Because she couldn't. Because the answer was no. Because Julian Thorne had never in his life been kind to anyone who didn't matter. And some part of Alara knew it. I'm not telling you not to marry him, I said gently, which was a lie. I was absolutely going to make sure she didn't marry him. I'm just asking you to notice. You can tell everything about a person by how they treat the people who can't help them. You just showed me everything good about you, on a staff room floor, with broken glass. I'd want you to know what Julian shows you when he thinks the people watching don't matter, because I've seen it, and it's not what he shows your family. Alara looked at me for a long, long moment, the hired loser in the bad suit who kept asking her the questions no one else would ask, and something shifted in her face, a door opening that her whole scheme depended on keeping shut, and she said, very quietly, "Who are you, Leo? Really? Because hired help in a bad suit doesn't talk like you talk, doesn't see what you see, doesn't ask what you ask. I keep telling myself you're just a kind man who fell on hard times. But that's not it, is it? There's something else, something you're not telling me." And I, the sovereign of the Founders Court, looked at the woman who was the first person in 3 years to see past every disguise to the something else underneath. And I gave her the only answer I could give, the one that was both a deflection and entirely true. I'm someone who's seen a lot of people pretend to be things they're not, Alara. Including, right now, you pretending you're sure about a marriage you're not sure about, and me pretending to be a loser when I'm something else entirely. We're both wearing costumes in this story. The difference is, you're wearing yours to save your family, and that's a good reason, even if the plan is wrong. I'm wearing mine because, well, I smiled. Let's just say the truth would change everything, and I'm not ready to change everything yet. But I will be. Soon. And when I take off this costume, Alara, I promise you, it's going to be the best thing that ever happened to you, and the worst thing that ever happened to House Thorne. You'll just have to trust the loser in the bad suit a little while longer. She didn't understand. How could she? But she looked at me with a new and searching attention. The attention of a woman who's begun to suspect that the least important person in her story might be the most important. And she said, "I don't know why, but I do trust you. The loser in the bad suit. More than anyone else in this whole thing." And I thought, you have no idea how right that is, and how right it's about to be. And I let her go back to the party, back to her snake fiancé and her drowning family and her scheme, while I went home to begin, in my real life, behind the veil, the work of finding out exactly what House Thorne had done to the Vance Foundry, and exactly what Alara Vance came with that was worth a great house's long and patient cruelty. The garden party was over. The contrast had worked. The families were relieved. The plan was on track. Julian had threatened the prop and cowed him. Everything was proceeding exactly as House Thorne wished. And the prop went home, took off the bad suit, sat down behind the veil that ruled the city, and began, very quietly, to pull the thread that would unravel all of it. Julian Thorne had told the loser to remember that people like him are easy to ruin. He was about to learn the truth of his own warning, with the names reversed. Because there was exactly one man in the city who was impossible to ruin, and House Thorne had hired him, in a bad suit, for $2,000 to stand at their wedding. To understand what I was able to do to House Thorne, and why I'd taken a gig as a hired loser in the first place, you need to understand the Founders Court, and how a man my age came to sit at the head of it, because the seat I hold is the strangest and loneliest power in the city, and it made me exactly the man this story needed, and the man Julian Thorne could not possibly have imagined existed. The Founders Court is older than any of the 5 great houses. When this city was founded, the founders, the first families, understood a danger that every concentration of power eventually faces. That great families, left to themselves, devour each other and the city with them, in cycles of feud and conquest that burn down everything worth having. So they created the court, a body that would sit above the houses, hold the ultimate authority, enforce the boundaries, settle the disputes, and prevent any single house from rising to swallow the rest. The court would be the throne above the thrones, the law above the lords, the one knee every house kept in reserve. And to keep the court itself from becoming just another house to be schemed against, the founders built it around a deliberate veil. The court would rule through ritual and decree and intermediary, its head, the sovereign, kept hidden, a power felt rather than seen, so that no house could ever quite reach him, flatter him, corrupt him, or move against him, because no house could ever quite find him. The seat passes by a complex succession the houses don't fully understand, and I won't fully explain. A combination of bloodline and selection, and the judgment of the court's officers, and 3 years ago, through a convergence of deaths and decisions, it passed to me, Leo Sterling, at 29, the youngest sovereign in the history of the court, a man barely prepared for a power that absolute. I'll spare you the full account of those first months, the terror and the loneliness and the vertigo of it. What matters is the thing I learned, fast and hard, the thing that shaped everything, that absolute power, exercised from behind a veil, over people who fear you and have never seen you, is the most isolating condition a human being can occupy. I became, at 29, a god that no one could see, ruling people who would do anything I commanded and never once tell me the truth, never once treat me as a man, never once say no. I had won the entire game of this city before I was 30, and the prize, as I've told you, was that the game stopped being playable, and I was left alone at the top of a structure where every relationship was a performance aimed at a throne. That's why I started slipping the veil, going among the city as no one. Not recklessness, though my officers called it that. Survival. The sovereign behind the veil was drowning in isolation, and the man named Leo, walking the city unseen, riding the trains, eating in diners, being told no by waitresses and ignored by strangers, was the only thing keeping the sovereign sane. Being no one was the medicine for being a god, and taking a gig as a hired loser was simply the strongest dose of that medicine I'd ever found. The chance to be not just no one, but the lowest one, the dismissed one, the man everyone looks down on, which is to say the man who finally, blessedly, gets to see everyone exactly as they are, because no one performs for a loser, no one fears a loser, no one hides from a loser. The gig wasn't a lark. It was, though I didn't fully understand it when I answering the ad, the thing my whole imprisoned soul was starving for. A chance to be a man among people who didn't know to perform, and to see, for once, the truth. And the truth I saw, as the hired loser, was Ilara Vance on a staff room floor, and Julian Thorne's mask coming off, and a fallen house's suspicious ruin, and a scheme that needed unraveling. The medicine had turned into a mission, and the mission had turned into the first thing in 3 years I actually cared about. And the bored god who'd answered an ad for amusement was now, against every expectation, fully, dangerously alive. I had one person in my real life I fully trusted, and his name was Kale. Kale was the chief officer of the court, the man who'd served the previous sovereign and now served me, the one human being who knew my face and my mind and had earned, over 3 years, my complete trust, the way Liam earns trust in another story, the way Chloe earns it in another, the way the loyal always earn it, by being loyal when no one was watching, and loyal when it cost him, and loyal in the specific way that has nothing to do with fear and everything to do with belief. Kale thought my disappearances into the city were dangerous. He thought my taking a job as a hired loser was insane. And he did it anyway, supported me anyway, because Kale understood, better than anyone, what the throne was doing to me. And Kale would rather have a sovereign who occasionally vanished into a bad suit than a sovereign who slowly went mad behind the veil. When I came home from the garden party and told Kale I needed the full file on the collapse of the Vance Foundry and the recent activities of House Thorne, Kale didn't ask why the sovereign of the Founders Court was investigating a foundry's bankruptcy on behalf of a gig he'd taken for $2,000. He just said, "So the bad suit found something," and got to work, because Kale had been waiting 3 years for something to make me come alive, and he could hear in my voice that something finally had. What Kale found over the following days confirmed everything, and was worse than I'd imagined. The Vance Foundry had not failed. It had been murdered, and House Thorne had held the night. The forensic trail, which Kale's people assembled with the full resources of the court, told a clear and ugly story. 2 years before, House Thorn had quietly, through intermediaries and shell entities, engineered the collapse of the Vance foundry, the same way a raider engineers a collapse, by cutting off its financing, poaching its key contracts, sabotaging its supply lines, and then, when it was weak, accelerating its fall. All of it hidden behind market forces and bad luck, all of it deniable, all of it patient and cold and deliberate. House Thorn had destroyed House Vance's last great asset on purpose, had engineered the fall of a great house, and had done it for a reason that took Cale longer to find, but that, when he found it, made the entire scheme snap into horrifying focus. The Vance foundry sat on something. Not the foundry itself, which was just an old industrial company. The land. The Vance foundry occupied a vast tract of land at the heart of the city's old industrial district, land that House Vance had held for a century, and that everyone, including House Vance, regarded as a declining asset, an old foundry on old land. But House Thorn's people had learned something that House Vance didn't know, something about a coming development, a massive municipal infrastructure project, a rezoning, that would transform that old industrial land into the single most valuable parcel in the city, worth a fortune so large it would, on its own, elevate whatever house controlled it above all the others. House Thorn had learned, before anyone else, that the Vance land was about to become a crown, and House Thorn had decided to take it. But they couldn't simply buy it. House Vance, fallen as it was, would never sell its ancestral land, and a direct move would alert the other houses and the court to what House Thorn had discovered. So House Thorn did the patient, cold, deniable thing. They destroyed House Vance. They engineered the foundry's collapse to bankrupt and desperate the family, to bring them so low that the land became a burden rather than a legacy. And then, with House Vance drowning and desperate for rescue, House Thorn would acquire the land the way the cruel always acquire what they want from the desperate. Through a marriage. Julian would marry Elara. The marriage would unite the houses, and, through the marriage settlement House Thorn had carefully structured, transfer control of the Vance ancestral land, the land that was about to become a crown, into House Thorn's hands. House Vance would get its rescue, a comfortable subordinate dependence on House Thorn's charity, and House Thorn would get the most valuable land in the city, the crown that would elevate them above all the houses, perhaps, eventually, above the court itself. That was what Elara came with. The land. The crown. The thing House Thorn had murdered her family to position themselves to take, through a marriage to a woman they deliberately made desperate, brokered by a fiancé who felt nothing for her but the cold satisfaction of a scheme nearing completion. Elara Vance, kneeling on staff room floors to help servers, scheming with all her kind, desperate heart to save her family, had no idea that the fall she was trying to recover from had been engineered by the very house she was marrying into, for the very land her marriage would surrender, in the cruelest and most patient long con I had encountered in 3 years of watching the great houses scheme. And it connected, finally, to the thing the court had been watching House Thorn for, the overreach, the ambition, the behavior of a house that had begun to imagine it might not need to kneel. Because a House Thorn that controlled the Vance crown land would be a house powerful enough to challenge the court itself, to break the balance the Founders' Court existed to maintain, to do the one thing the court was created to prevent, rise high enough to swallow the others and threaten the throne above the thrones. Arthur Thorn wasn't just scheming to take a fallen family's land. He was making the opening move in a play for the city itself, a play against the court, against the balance, against me. The marriage of Julian and Elara wasn't only a personal cruelty. It was the first step in House Thorn's bid to rise above the law that ruled them, and the fallen heiress on the staff room floor was the lever House Thorn intended to use to pry the whole city loose. I sat behind the veil with the full file, the sovereign of the Founders' Court, and I felt the two halves of myself click into perfect, dangerous alignment. The man named Leo, who had fallen for a kind woman being used by a snake, wanted to save Elara and destroy Julian. And the sovereign, whose throne and whose city were the ultimate target of House Thorn's scheme, had every right and every duty to crush House Thorn's overreach completely. For the first time in 3 years, what my heart wanted and what my throne required were the same thing, aimed at the same enemy, and the alignment was total. and it made me the single most dangerous man House Thorn could possibly have offended, which they had, thoroughly, by hiring me as a prop and threatening me at a garden party. "Kale," I said, closing the file. "House Thorn murdered a great house to steal a crown, and they're using a marriage to do it, and the marriage's whole purpose is to position them to move against the court, against us, against the balance the founders built this seat to protect." I looked at my chief officer, the loyal man who'd waited 3 years for me to come alive. "I want the entire case airtight. Every shell entity, every sabotaged contract, every cut financing line, the whole murder of the Vance Foundry, documented to a standard that not even a great house can deny. And I want the marriage settlement, the land transfer, the proof that Julian Thorn is marrying a woman his family ruined in order to steal the crown her family doesn't know it's sitting on." I stood. "And then, Kale, I'm going to do something the sovereign of the Founders Court has never done in the history of the seat. I'm going to attend a wedding, in person, unveiled, because House Thorn built their entire scheme on the wedding being the moment of their triumph, the moment the land transfers, the moment the crown is theirs. So that's the moment I'm going to take it from them, at the wedding, in front of every guest, where the heir of House Thorn, when he turns to dismiss the shameful prop one last time, is going to see the face of the man his father kneels to, and understand, far too late, exactly who his family hired to stand at their wedding. The cold and the warmth, aligned, complete. Ilara Vance hired a shameful fiancé to save her family. She accidentally hired the one man in the city who could actually save it and make House Thorn pay for murdering it, and do both at the same wedding. Let's give her money's worth, Kale. Let's give her the wedding of the century. I've told you I inherited the seat young, at 29, the youngest sovereign in the history of the Founders Court, and that it nearly drove me mad, and you deserve the fuller version, because the man who walked into Ilara's scheme was shaped entirely by the 3 years between the seat and the gig, and because the loneliness of absolute power is a thing almost no one ever gets told the truth about, and I'd like to tell it. I was not raised to be the sovereign. That's the first thing. The seat does not pass simply father to son, the way the great houses pass. The founders built it more strangely than that, a combination of bloodline and selection and the judgment of the court's officers, designed precisely so that no house could ever predict or control the succession. I knew, growing up, that I carried one of the bloodlines that made me eligible, the way perhaps a dozen people in the city knew it of themselves. But eligibility is not inheritance, and I never expected the seat. And I built my early life around ordinary ambitions, a real career, real friendships, the normal architecture of a normal life. And then, 3 years ago, a convergence I won't detail, deaths and judgments and the court's ancient machinery landed the seat on me, at 29, with almost no warning and no preparation, and the ordinary life I'd built evaporated overnight. Because you cannot be the sovereign of the Founders Court and also have ordinary friends, and an ordinary career, and an ordinary place in the world. The seat consumes all of that. The seat requires the veil. And so at 29, I had to disappear from my own life, sever the ordinary connections, vanish behind the court's concealment, and become a thing felt rather than seen, a power without a face, the loneliest position the city has. The loneliness is the part no one warns you about, because no one who holds the seat ever talks about it, because to whom would they talk? I went, in the space of a few months, from a young man with friends and a future to the most powerful and most isolated person in the city. Every relationship I had to end or hollow out, because the sovereign cannot have ordinary friends who might be leveraged against him, cannot have a public life that might be traced. Every new relationship the seat brought me was a performance aimed at the throne. Terror and flattery and calculation, never once a person seeing me. I had absolute power and absolute isolation, and I learned fast that they're the same thing, that the more completely you can command everyone, the more completely you're alone, because command and connection are opposites, and a man everyone must obey is a man no one can simply know. I nearly didn't survive the first year. I'll be honest about that. There were nights, behind the veil, holding the most absolute power in the city, when I understood why the histories of the court are full of sovereigns who went strange, went cruel, went mad. Because the seat is an isolation chamber, and human beings are not built to live in isolation chambers, no matter how gilded. And the power that everyone imagines is the prize is actually the prison, and the prison breaks most of the people it holds. I felt myself beginning to break that first year, felt the isolation curdling into the specific madness of gods, the loss of the ability to see other people as real, the slow conviction that since no one will ever treat you as human, perhaps no one is quite human. Perhaps the whole city is just pieces on a board, and you the only player. That's how the cruel sovereigns are made, I understood. Not by evil, by isolation. By being treated as a god long enough that you forget the people treating you that way are real, because they've forgotten you're real first. And the thing that saved me, the thing that kept me from becoming one of the strange, cruel sovereigns the history's warn about, was two things, and the first was Kale. Kale had served the previous sovereign, and Kale stayed to serve me. And Kale was the one person in my new life who treated me from the first day as a man rather than a throne. Not disrespectfully, never that. Kale understood the seat and honored it. But Kale had served a sovereign before, had watched a man hold the seat and stay human, and Kale knew the thing the histories knew, that the seat's great danger is the isolation, and Kale made it his quiet mission to keep me human, to be the one person who'd tell me the truth, who'd disagree with me, who'd treat me as a person with a person's needs rather than a power with a power's prerogatives. When I began to slip, that first year, when Kale saw the isolation starting to curdle me, it was Kale who said, "You need to be a man sometimes, Leo, or you'll stop being one. And a sovereign who's stopped being a man is the most dangerous thing this city can produce." The founders veiled the seat to protect the city from the houses. But nothing protects the city from a sovereign who's gone strange behind the veil. So you have to protect yourself, and the only way to do it is to find some way, however small, to be an ordinary man among ordinary people, to be told no, to be treated as nothing, to remember what it is to be human, because the day you forget is the day this city is in real danger. It was Kale who first suggested I slip the veil, go among the city as no one, the radical medicine. And it was Kale who covered for those disappearances, who managed the risk, who chose every time to let his sovereign vanish into ordinary life rather than watch him calcify into a god. Because Kale understood that the disappearances weren't recklessness but survival, and that a sovereign who could still be a man was worth 1,000 times more to the city than a sovereign safely sealed behind a veil and slowly going mad. I owe Kale my soul, more or less. He's the loyal man in this story, the one who served not out of fear but out of belief, the one who chose again and again the harder loyalty of keeping his sovereign human over the easier loyalty of keeping him safe. And the second thing that saved me, the thing the disappearances gave me, was the city itself, the ordinary city, seen from the bottom. The first time I slipped the veil, terrified, in borrowed ordinary clothes, and walked into a crowded train and had a stranger jostle me without apology, and a tired worker ignore me completely, and a vendor shortchange me and treat me with brisk indifference, I nearly wept in the middle of the train because it was the most human contact I'd had in a year. To be jostled, to be ignored, to be treated as nothing, as one more ordinary person in a city full of them, was, after a year of terror and flattery, the most precious experience imaginable, because it was real, because no one on that train was performing for the throne, because for 1 hour I got to be a man among men, instead of a god among performers. The ordinary city, the bottom, the place where no one knew or cared who I was, became my lifeline, the medicine that kept me human, the only place I could go to remember that other people were real, and so was I. And over the months and the years, the disappearances taught me the thing that became my whole philosophy of power, the thing that made me different from the strange, cruel sovereigns of the histories, the thing that made the gig with Alara possible and meaningful. They taught me that the bottom sees the truth, that the powerless are the only ones who'll show you reality, that a ruler trapped at the top is a ruler who's blind, and that the discipline of going to the bottom, of being treated as nothing, of seeing the city from the place where no one performs, is not a weakness or an indulgence, but the single most important thing a powerful person can do, the only protection against the madness of the heights, and the only road to the truth. I ruled better for the disappearances. I saw my city clearly because I kept returning to the bottom of it. I stayed human because I kept being treated as nothing. The medicine Kale prescribed to keep me sane turned out to be the secret of governing well, and by the time Elara's ad crossed my screen, I was not just a bored god looking for amusement. I was a sovereign who had built his whole soul around the conviction that the truth lives at the bottom, and that the man who'd be wise must go there. And an ad seeking a man willing to be the lowest person in the room was not a lark to such a man. It was a calling. So when I took the gig, when I became the shameful fiancé, I was doing the thing that had saved my life and sharpened my rule for 3 years, going to the bottom, being treated as nothing, to see the truth. I just didn't expect the truth I'd find to be a kind woman on a staff room floor, or a murdered house, or a love that would give me back the last piece of my humanity that even the disappearances couldn't reach. Not just the experience of being treated as nothing, but the experience of being loved as nothing. Loved for myself, by someone who thought I had no throne at all. The disappearances kept me human. Elara made me whole. And both of them came from the same root, the same discipline, the same conviction that I'd built my survival on. Go to the bottom. The truth is there. And so, it turned out, was the only thing my absolute power had never been able to buy. The love of a person who didn't know I was powerful, and loved the man anyway, which is the only love that was ever worth having, and the only one a god can never command. And the one I found, at the bottom, in a bad suit where I'd gone, as always, simply to remember what it was to be real. The 2 weeks between the garden party and the wedding were the strangest and best 2 weeks of my adult life, because in them I lived 2 lives at once, perfectly opposed and perfectly aligned. By day, behind the veil, I was the sovereign of the Founder's Court, assembling with Kale the case that would destroy House Thorn, building the trap with the full cold resources of the most absolute power in the city. And by evening, in the bad suit, I was Leo, the hired loser, attending the run of pre-wedding events where I was meant to be the contrast, the cautionary tale, the embarrassment that made Julian shine. And in those evenings, in the role of the man everyone looked down on, I fell deeper in love with Elara Vance, and more dangerously and more wonderfully, she began to fall in love with me. That was never the plan. I want to be clear about that because it matters to what came after. I did not set out to make Elara love the prop. My plan was to protect her, expose Julian, destroy House Thorn's scheme, and save her family, all of which I could do as the sovereign without her ever loving the loser. But you cannot spend evening after evening beside a person, being the only one who asks if she's okay, being the only one who sees her kindness, being the only one who treats her as a person rather than a prize or a lever, without something growing. And it grew, in both of us, in the spaces between the scheme. And by the second week I understood that the thing happening between Elara Vance and the man in the bad suit was the realest thing in either of our lives, and the most complicated, because she was falling in love with a poor nobody 2 weeks before her wedding to a great house's heir, and the poor nobody was secretly the most powerful man in the city, and neither of those truths was one she could survive learning the wrong way. It deepened in small moments, the way real things do. There was the evening she found me, in character, eating a cheap sandwich alone in a corner while the engagement party swirled around Julian, and instead of maintaining the cold distance the scheme required, she came and sat beside me, the heiress beside the prop, and shared my terrible sandwich, and talked to me, really talked, about her father, who died when the foundry first began to struggle, about how she'd watched her family's grief curdle into desperation, about how the whole scheme, the fake fiancé, the manipulated marriage, was her trying, in the only way she could see, to fix something that had been broken since her father died, and how tired she was, how bone-tired, of carrying her family's salvation alone. And I listened, the way no one in her life listened, and I thought about House Thorn murdering her father's company and engineering this exact desperation, and I had to hold very still to keep the sovereign's cold fury off the prop's gentle face. There was the evening Julian, in front of others, made a cutting joke at my expense, the kind of casual cruelty he deployed to remind everyone of the contrast, and Elara, who was supposed to let it happen, who needed the contrast for her scheme, instead cut him off, sharply, and said, "That's enough, Julian. He's a person. Be kind or be quiet." and the table went still because it broke the scheme, because the bride was supposed to be embarrassed by the prop, not defending him, and I watched Julian's mask flicker with annoyance. And I watched Ilara realize she'd broken character and not care, because some things had become more important to her than the scheme. And one of those things, impossibly, was the dignity of the hired loser. And I understood that she was choosing me in small, unconscious ways over the plan her family's salvation depended on, and that she didn't even fully know she was doing it. And there was the evening, the one that changed everything, when Ilara asked me to walk her home. And at her gate, in the dark, she stopped, and she looked at me for a long time, and she said, "Leo, I have to tell you something, and it's going to ruin everything, and I have to say it anyway because I can't keep not saying it." She took a breath. "I think I've made a terrible mistake, not hiring you. That's the only good decision I've made in 2 years. The marriage, Julian. I think I'm marrying the wrong man, and I think I've known it for a while, and I think the reason I've finally let myself know it is you." Her voice shook. "You're a poor nobody in a bad suit that I hired to be humiliated, and you're the kindest, sharpest, most decent person I've met in my entire life, and you've made me see that I've been about to sell myself to a man who's never once been kind to anyone who couldn't help him, for a rescue I'm not even sure is real. And I don't, Leo, I don't know what to do, because my family needs this marriage, and I think I'm falling for the fake fiancé instead of the real one. And that's insane. That's the most insane thing. Falling for the man I hired to be a joke. But I am, and I had to tell you, even though it ruins everything. Even though there's no version of this where the heiress and the hired loser, even though it's impossible, I had to say it. I'm falling in love with you. The prop. The nobody. You. And I don't know what to do. I stood at the gate of the fallen house, the sovereign of the founder's court, and the woman I loved had just told me she loved me, loved the poor nobody, loved Leo, before she had any idea who Leo was, which is the only kind of love worth having. The love that comes for you when you have nothing. The love I'd thought my throne had made impossible because no one would ever again love the man instead of the power. And here it was, at a gate, in the dark, offered by a woman who thought she was throwing away her family's salvation to love a man in a bad suit. It was the thing I'd wanted most in 3 years and given up hope of ever having. And I could not, yet, tell her the truth, because the truth was a weapon I needed to deploy at exactly the right moment, at the wedding, to save her family and destroy House Thorn, and telling her now would scatter the trap. But I could not let her stand there, having bared her heart to a nobody, and think the nobody didn't feel it too. So I gave her the most truth I could afford. "Ilara," I said, "listen to me carefully, because I'm going to say something that won't make sense yet, and I need you to hold on to it. You're not insane. You're the sanest person in this entire story. You've fallen for the man who treats you like a person instead of a prize, and that's not a mistake. That's the only thing in this whole scheme that's been right. And I have to tell you, even though I can't explain it yet, even though it's going to sound impossible, I'm falling for you too. I have been since I watched you kneel in your party dress to help a server off a floor of broken glass. You're the realest person I've met in years, and I am exactly as in love with you as you are with me, the prop, the nobody, all of it." I took her hands. "But I need you to trust me about one more thing, and it's the hardest thing I've ever asked anyone to trust me about. Do not call off the wedding. Do not run. Do not blow up the scheme. Go through with it, right up to the ceremony, exactly as planned." She started to protest, stricken, and I held her hands tighter. "I know how that sounds. I know it sounds like I'm telling the woman I love to marry another man. I'm not. I'm telling you to trust me that there is a reason I can't explain yet, that the wedding has to happen, that everyone has to be in that room, that the scheme has to run all the way to the altar. Because at that wedding, Ilara, everything is going to change. The truth about a great many things, including me, including Julian, including what happened to your family, is going to come out. At exactly the right moment, in exactly the right room. And when it does, you're going to be free. Your family's going to be saved, really saved. Not the false rescue Julian's offering, and the man in the bad suit is going to turn out to be the best thing that ever happened to you. I swear it. I swear it on everything I am, which is more than you know. Just trust the loser in the bad suit one more time. Walk into that wedding, and watch what happens when I finally take off the costume." Ilara looked at me, tears on her face, torn between the impossibility of what I was asking and the trust she'd been building in me for 2 weeks, the trust that had no rational basis and was, nonetheless, completely correct. And she said, "Who are you, Leo? You keep saying it. The costume. The truth about you. More than I know. Who are you really?" And I smiled, and I kissed her forehead gently, the first time I'd touched her like that, and I said, "I'm the man who's going to walk into your wedding as a hired loser and walk out as the answer to every problem you have. That's who I am. The rest, you'll see, at the wedding, with everyone. 3 more days, Ilara. Trust me, 3 more days. Marry the snake right up to the moment before the vows, and then watch the costume come off." And I left her at the gate, stunned and trusting and in love. And I went home to the court, and I told Kale the trap was nearly ready, and the bride was in love with the prop. And Kale, who had served 2 sovereigns and seen everything, looked at me and said, "She loves you not knowing who you are." Do you understand how rare that is for a man in your seat? In the entire history of the court, I'm not sure a single sovereign has ever been loved for himself instead of his throne. You found it in a bad suit, at a fallen house, from a woman you were hired to humiliate. Whatever else happens at this wedding, Leo, don't lose that. The throne you can always reclaim. That you might only get once. And I said, "I know, Kale. Believe me, I know. Now let's make sure the wedding goes perfectly, so that the woman who loves the nobody gets to keep loving him after she finds out he's the sovereign, instead of feeling like she was made a fool of. The timing has to be perfect. Her heart is in this now. I won't let the reveal break it. The reveal has to free her, not humiliate her. Tell me the trap is precise enough for that." And Kale said, "It will be. For her, it will be." Because Kale understood, the way the loyal always understand, that this was no longer about destroying a house. It was about a man getting the one thing his power had cost him and protecting it, fiercely, all the way through the storm he was about to unleash. There was a moment, in the final week before the wedding, that I have saved to tell you separately, because it is the purest, dramatic irony of the entire affair, and because living it required a discipline I'm not sure I knew I had. I summoned Arthur Thorne to the Founders' Court on a routine matter, and the Lion of House Thorne knelt before the veiled sovereign and pledged his loyalty, never once imagining that the sovereign behind the veil was the shameful prop his son was about to humiliate at a wedding. It happened because of the court's ordinary business. The Founders' Court summons the patriarchs of the great houses periodically for the rituals of fealty and the settling of disputes, and in the final week before the wedding, a routine matter arose that required Arthur Thorne's attendance, an ordinary administrative summons that had nothing to do with the wedding or the scheme or my investigation. And I realized, when Kale brought me the schedule, that I had an opportunity so exquisite I could not pass it up. To receive Arthur Thorne behind the veil as the sovereign, the very week I was attending his son's wedding as the prop. To sit in judgment over the Lion of House Thorne, who had no idea that the sovereign he was kneeling to and the loser his family had hired were the same man. I'll admit the temptation to reveal it then, to end the suspense, was real. I held all the evidence by that point. I could have, at that summons behind the veil, simply confronted Arthur Thorne with his crimes and ended House Thorne's scheme in the privacy of the court. It would have been cleaner. It would have been safer. It would have spared Ilara the terror of walking into a wedding she didn't want. But I didn't, for 2 reasons, and the reasons are the heart of who I'd become. The first was strategic. Ending it privately, behind the veil, would have let House Thorne's crimes stay hidden, would have corrected the house without exposing the rot to the other houses, would have missed the chance to teach the whole ruling class the lesson the public unveiling would teach. The crimes needed sunlight, and sunlight meant the wedding, the public moment, the spectacle. And the second reason was Ilara. I had promised her freedom delivered in a way that honored her, that freed her family really and completely, that gave her the public vindication of watching the truth come out in front of everyone, rather than the private, deniable half-resolution of a behind-the-veil correction that the world would never see. Ilara deserved the wedding. She deserved to watch the snake fall in front of 300 witnesses. She deserved the public restoration of her murdered house. And so I held the discipline, and I received Arthur Thorne at the court, behind the veil, and I gave nothing away, and it was the most exquisite hour of restraint in my life. He knelt, the lion of House Thorne, the man who terrified the entire city, on the floor of the court, before the veiled sovereign, and he pledged his fealty in the ancient words, his forehead nearly to the stone. And I sat behind the veil and looked down at the patriarch who had murdered a great house and was about to steal a crown, and was, in his arrogance, beginning to scheme against the very throne he was kneeling to, and who had hired me, in a bad suit, to stand at his son's wedding. And I thought, you have knelt to me 100 times, Arthur, in this room, in those words, and you have begun to imagine you might not need to kneel forever, that House Thorne might rise above this throne. And the throne you're scheming against has spent the last 2 weeks being mocked at your garden parties and threatened by your son and dismissed by your whole house as the shameful prop. You are kneeling, right now, to the loser you hired. You just can't see my face. And in 1 week, you will, and you will remember this moment, this fealty, these words, and you will understand that the sovereign you were scheming against was standing in your son's wedding the whole time, dismissed, watching, gathering the evidence that will end you. The irony of it was so vast and so perfect that I had to hold very still behind the veil to keep my voice level, the sovereign receiving the fealty of the man he was about to destroy, who'd hired him as a prop, who was kneeling to the prop right now without knowing it. I conducted the routine business with perfect formality. I gave nothing away. And at the end, as Arthur Thorne prepared to depart, I allowed myself one small indulgence, one tiny crack of the door, because I could not entirely resist it. I said, in the sovereign's formal voice, from behind the veil, House Thorne has served the court for generations, Arthur. The court has noted of late a certain ambition in your house. I will say only this, as counsel, before you go. The founders built this seat to keep any house from rising too high, from forgetting the knee it must bend. Houses that remember their place endure. Houses that forget it, that begin to imagine they might rise above the throne, that begin to acquire crowns through cruelty and reach for more than their station. Those houses, Arthur, have a way of discovering, suddenly and completely, that the throne they'd forgotten was watching the entire time, often from closer than they imagined. I'd reflect on that if I were you in the week ahead. The throne is always closer than you think. Sometimes it's in the very room you'd least expect. Go in fealty, Arthur Thorne. And remember the knee. And I watched Arthur Thorne, the lion, take the counsel as routine sovereign formality, a vague warning of the kind the court issues, never once hearing the specific blade in it, never once imagining that the throne was telling him, plainly, that it was watching from closer than he imagined, from the very wedding he was about to celebrate, from the bad suit of the prop. He bowed, and he departed, certain in his scheme, certain in his rise, certain the throne was a distant, veiled abstraction, and not, as it actually was, the man his son had threatened at a bar. Cale, who knew the whole situation, who had stood through the summons keeping his own face perfectly still, said to me after Arthur had gone, "That was the most restrained thing I've ever watched a human being do. He knelt to you. He pledged fealty to you. And you let him walk out still scheming, still arrogant, still certain, when you could have ended it right there." He shook his head. Why? Truly. Not the strategy. I understand the strategy, the sunlight, the public lesson. But there was something else in it. You wanted him to walk out not knowing. You wanted to receive his fealty and let him leave still blind. Why? And I told Cale the truth, which surprised even me a little. Because, Cale, the deepest justice for a man like Arthur Thorne isn't the fall. It's the moment of understanding. The moment he realizes that everything he was certain of was wrong. That the throne he schemed against was watching from inside his own scheme. That the prop he hired was the power he forgot to fear. That his whole arrogant edifice of certainty was blind from the foundation. The fall is just consequence. The understanding is the justice. And the understanding only lands with full force if he's fully certain first, fully arrogant, fully blind, all the way to the wedding. If I'd ended it here behind the veil, he'd have fallen, but he'd never have felt the specific, total, world-inverting understanding of having knelt to the prop, of having been blind in exactly the way his whole philosophy made him blind. I want him to feel that at the wedding in front of everyone. Not for cruelty, for justice. Because the lesson of his fall, the lesson the whole city needs, is that the contempt for the nobody is a blindness, and the only way to make Arthur Thorne truly understand his blindness is to let him be blind all the way to the moment of revelation, so that the revelation is total, so that he understands not just that he lost, but exactly how and why he was blind, which is the only understanding that ever actually teaches anyone anything. I looked at the veil I ruled from. He knelt to the prop today, Cale, and didn't know it. In 1 week, he'll kneel to the prop again and know it. And the distance between those two kneels is the whole lesson. That's the justice, not the fall. The understanding of the blindness. And it only works if I let him stay blind 1 more week. So I let him walk out. The hardest, most satisfying restraint of my life. It was, too. And when, at the wedding, Arthur Thorne stood gray and rigid as the great houses knelt around him, and I reminded him, in front of everyone, that I'd told him the throne was always closer than he imagined, sometimes in the very room he'd least expect. I watched him remember the summons, remember the council he'd dismissed as routine, remember kneeling to the veiled sovereign the very week he schemed, and I watched the full understanding land, the total inversion, the recognition that he'd been blind all the way down, that the throne had told him plainly and he hadn't heard, because his contempt for the nobody had made him deaf to the warning the same way it had made him blind to the prop. That was the justice, the understanding of the blindness, and I'd bought it, that perfect, devastating understanding, with 1 hour of exquisite restraint behind a veil, receiving the fealty of the man I was about to destroy, who knelt to the prop and didn't know it, the week before he'd kneel to the prop and never recover. The night before the wedding, House Thorne tried to have me removed, and the way they tried tells you everything about why they deserved what was coming, and it nearly ended the whole plan before it began. Julian Thorne, it turned out, had not been content to threaten the prop at the garden party. As the wedding approached, with the land transfer and the crown so close he could taste it, Julian had grown nervous about the loose end of the hired loser, the man who'd seen too much, who'd been too close to Elara, who his instincts, Snake's instincts, told him was somehow wrong, somehow more than he appeared. And so Julian did what men like Julian do with loose ends. He moved to cut it. The night before the wedding, 2 men came to the cheap apartment where Leo, the hired loser, supposedly lived. The address I'd given Elara, an address my officers had set up precisely because I'd anticipated exactly this. 2 men, sent by Julian, to have a conversation with the prop, to frighten him, to pay him to vanish before the wedding, or, if he wouldn't take the money, to make sure he couldn't show up to the ceremony at all. They were not prepared for what they found, which was nothing, an empty, staged apartment, because the sovereign of the Founders Court does not actually live in a cheap apartment, and because Cale's people were watching that apartment precisely for this. And so the 2 men sent to remove the prop were themselves quietly intercepted, identified, documented, and added to the case file. 1 more piece of evidence of House Thorne's methods, the heir of a great house sending men to threaten a hired laborer the night before his wedding to keep a scheme from unraveling. Julian thought he'd cut a loose end. He'd actually handed me the final perfect piece of evidence, proof of his willingness to use violence against the powerless, documented and ready, to be deployed at exactly the right moment. It was almost too fitting. The snake, reaching to eliminate the prop, had bitten the 1 man in the city who could not be bitten, and had left his fangs in the evidence file. But the attempt rattled Elara badly, and that was the real danger of the night before the wedding, because Elara heard about it, heard that Leo had been threatened, that men had come for him, and she nearly destroyed everything trying to protect the man she loved. She called me frantic the night before the wedding, having learned somehow through the household whispers that Julian's people had gone looking for the prop. "Leo, you have to disappear," she said, her voice tight with fear. "Julian sent men for you. I don't know what he means to do, but it's not good. There's a coldness in him I've been pretending not to see, and now he's sending men. And I will not let you be hurt because of my scheme. I won't. The wedding isn't worth your safety. Nothing is. Please, take the money and go. Go far. Tonight. I'll handle my family some other way. I'll find another path. Just please be safe. I couldn't bear it if something happened to you because of me." and I heard, in her terror for me, the full depth of what had grown between us. A woman willing to throw away her family's salvation, her whole scheme, to protect the safety of a hired nobody, and it nearly undid my resolve, because every part of me wanted to tell her the truth right then, to say, Ilara, I'm not in danger. I'm the most powerful man in the city. No one can touch me. Stop being afraid for me. I'm about to save you. But I couldn't. Not the night before, not over a phone, not in a way that would scatter the trap and rob her of the freedom the wedding would deliver. So I did the hardest thing. I held the line, and I reassured her without revealing, and I asked her one final time for the trust that would cost her the most. Ilara, listen, I'm safe. I promise you I am far safer than you can possibly imagine, and Julian's men found an empty apartment, and they're not going to find me because I'm much better at disappearing than Julian is at finding people. Do you understand? I'm not in danger. Not from Julian, not from anyone. You have to believe me. I gentled my voice against her fear. And I need you, one more time, the last time, to do the impossible thing. Go to your wedding tomorrow. Walk down that aisle, right up to the vows. I know it's terrifying. I know Julian frightens you now, and you're right to be frightened. He's worse than you know. But I need everyone in that room tomorrow. Julian, his father, your family, all of it. Because tomorrow, at that wedding, I am going to end Julian Thorne's power over you and your family forever. And I can only do it if everyone is there, at the altar, in the moment they think they've won. Trust me one more time. Walk into that wedding, and know, the whole time, no matter how frightening it gets, that the man you love is in that room, and is about to change everything, and that you are about to be free. Can you do that? Can you trust the loser in the bad suit through one more terrifying day? There was a long silence on the line, and then Ilara, my brave, terrified Ilara, said, Yes. God help me, yes. I don't understand any of it. I don't understand how a poor man in a bad suit can promise to end a great house's power, and I don't understand why I believe you. But I do. I believe you completely, more than I've believed anyone in my life, and I'll walk into that wedding, and I'll trust you, all the way to the altar. Because if these 2 weeks have taught me anything, it's that the man everyone looks down on is the only one in my whole world worth trusting. She paused. But Leo, whatever you are, whatever the truth is, whatever happens tomorrow, I need you to know it doesn't change what I said at the gate. I fell in love with the man in the bad suit, the one who asked if I was okay, the one who saw me. Whatever you turn out to be, that's who I love. The nobody. Don't let whatever you're planning tomorrow make me lose the nobody. He's the best thing that ever happened to me. And I closed my eyes, the sovereign of the Founder's Court, and I said, You won't lose him, Ilara. I swear it on everything I am. The man in the bad suit is the realest part of me, and he's not going anywhere. Tomorrow, you're just going to find out that he comes with, let's say, some unexpected advantages. Now sleep. Be brave one more day, and watch the costume come off. And I hung up, and I sat alone behind the veil, holding the most precious and most fragile thing I'd found in 3 years, a woman's love for the man instead of the throne. And I understood that the wedding tomorrow was not only the destruction of House Thorne and the salvation of House Vance, but the single most delicate operation of my life, because I had to reveal myself as the sovereign in a way that freed Ilara without making her feel that the nobody she loved had been a lie, that she'd been the only one in the room who didn't know, that her love had been a kind of foolishness. The reveal had to honor her love, not humiliate it. And that, far more than destroying a great house, was the thing I lay awake planning. Cale came to me late that night with the final confirmation. The case is complete, he said. The murder of the Vance Foundry, every shell entity and sabotaged contract, documented to a standard no house can deny. The marriage settlement and the land transfer, proof that the entire wedding exists to steal the Vance crown land. The men Julian sent tonight, documented, proof of his methods. And the larger pattern, House Thorne's overreach, the land as the opening move in a bid against the court itself, all of it assembled into a single, sealed indictment. He set it before me. It's airtight, Leo. When you unveil tomorrow and present this, House Thorne has nothing. No defense, no escape, no spin. The heir is exposed as a man who married a woman his family ruined to steal her family's crown, and sent thugs after a laborer to cover it. The patriarch is exposed as a house lord scheming against the court he's sworn to, and every guest, every other house, every witness sees it all, at the wedding, from the sovereign himself, unveiled for the first time in the history of the seat. Cale paused. It's the most complete destruction of a great house I've seen in my service. And you're going to deliver it personally, unveiled, at a wedding, to save a woman who loves you not knowing who you are. He almost smiled. The previous sovereign would have done this with a sealed decree from behind the veil, cold, invisible, bureaucratically perfect. You're going to do it in person, in a bad suit, at an altar, for love. I'm not sure the founders ever imagined a sovereign like you. But I'll tell you, Leo, in 3 years, I've never been prouder to serve the seat. Because for the first time, the man in the seat is using the most absolute power in the city for the most human possible reason. Go to bed. Tomorrow, the throne above the thrones comes down off its veil, and a snake learns what he really hired. And a kind woman gets her whole life back, all at once, at a wedding. It's going to be magnificent. I didn't sleep much the night before the wedding. I lay awake and thought about Alara kneeling on a staff room floor, and Julian's mask coming off at the bar, and a fallen house's grief, and a murdered foundry, and a crown of land, and a woman's voice at a gate saying, I fell in love with the man in the bad suit. And I thought about the morning to come, the cheap suit one last time, the cheap bouquet, the walk into House Thorne's moment of triumph, and the instant, the perfect instant, when Julian Thorne would turn to dismiss the prop one final time and see instead the face of the man his father knelt to. And I confess to you that the sovereign of the founder's court, the most powerful man in the city, lay awake the night before a wedding as nervous and as alive as a boy, because the next day he was going to take off every costume he had, the bad suit and the veil both, and stand revealed, fully as himself, in front of the woman he loved and the enemy he was about to destroy, and find out whether the man underneath all the disguises was someone worth loving and worth kneeling to both. He was. We were about to prove it. At a wedding, in a suit that didn't fit, with the whole city about to learn who'd been standing among them, dismissed all along. The wedding of Julian Thorne and Alara Vance was held in the grand ballroom of the Thorne estate. 300 guests, every great house represented, the social event of the season. The public triumph House Thorne had engineered their entire long cruelty to reach. And I arrived as I'd been hired to arrive, the shameful fiancé, the prop, in my cheap suit that didn't fit, carrying a cheap bouquet, walking into House Thorne's moment of triumph as the lowest person in the room, the dismissed laborer, the loser the bride was so eager to be rid of. The plan, House Thorne's plan, Ilara's original plan, called for me to be visible just long enough to be the final contrast, the embarrassment that made Julian's salvation complete, and then to vanish, paid off, forgotten. I walked into that ballroom and I felt every great house in the city look at me and dismiss me in the same instant, the collective reflexive contempt of the powerful for the powerless. 300 of the most important people in the city deciding in a single glance that I did not matter. And I savored it, the way you savor the last moment before a thing you've waited for, because in about 10 minutes, every one of those 300 dismissals was going to reverse, all at once. And there is no pleasure in the world quite like being underestimated by everyone in the room you're about to own. Ilara was there at the front, in her wedding dress, pale and brave and trusting, and when her eyes found me across the ballroom, the prop in the bad suit, I saw her steady herself. Saw her hold on to the impossible trust I'd asked of her. Saw her think, the man I love is in the room, and something is about to change. And Julian was there, resplendent, triumphant, the heir at the summit of his family's scheme, moments from the marriage that would transfer the crown land and begin House Thorne's rise against the court. And Arthur Thorne, the lion of House Thorne, the patriarch, presided over it all with the satisfaction of a man watching a long, patient, cruel plan reach its perfect fruition. The ceremony began, and I waited, the prop in the back, for my moment, which was not yet, which was coming, which I had timed with the precision of a man who'd built his life on timing. I let the ceremony proceed. I let House Thorne taste their triumph fully. I let it run, almost to the vows, almost to the moment of the land transfer, almost to the instant their scheme completed. Because the deepest principle I'd learned, the one that had never failed me, was that you let the enemy commit completely, publicly, irrevocably, in the moment of their total certainty. And then you take it all away, so there is nothing left to spin and nowhere left to run. And then, just before the vows, the officiant asked the ancient question, the one weddings still ask, whether any person present knew a reason these two should not be joined. The question that is usually a formality, a beat of silence, a tradition. I stepped forward, the prop, the loser, the hired nobody in the cheap suit, into the center of the grand ballroom of House Thorn, and I said, in a voice that was no longer Leo the laborer's apologetic murmur, but something else, something that carried, something that filled the room with an authority that made 300 powerful people turn in startled confusion. I do. I know a reason. The ballroom rippled with the particular outrage of the powerful interrupted by the powerless. Murmurs, scoffs, the beginnings of someone signaling for security to remove the embarrassing prop who dared to speak. And Julian Thorne turned, his face tightening with fury, to deal with the loose end he'd failed to cut, to dismiss the prop one final time, to have the laborer thrown out of his wedding. And then Julian Thorne looked at my face. Really looked, for the first time, without the contempt that had let him dismiss me. Looked because the prop had spoken with an authority that forced him to actually see. And I watched it happen. The thing I'd waited the whole story for. The thing the hook promised you. I watched recognition crash over Julian Thorne's face. Because Julian Thorne, as the heir of a great house, had been to the founder's court, had stood in its presence, had glimpsed, on one rare and terrifying occasion, behind the veil, the face of the sovereign his father knelt to. Almost no one in the city had seen that face. Julian was one of the very few who had. And now he was seeing it again, in his own wedding, attached to the body of the shameful prop he'd threatened and dismissed and sent men to remove, and his mind could not, for a moment, reconcile it. The most powerful face in the city on the lowest man in the room. And I watched the blood drain entirely out of Julian Thorne's face. Watched the triumph and the fury collapse into pure, disbelieving, dawning horror. Watched him understand, all at once, what his family had hired, what he had threatened, what was standing in the center of his wedding in a suit that didn't fit. And Julian Thorne, heir of House Thorn, at his own wedding, in front of 300 guests, dropped to one knee. Because in Julian Thorne's world, you kneel before exactly one man. And that man had just shown up to his wedding as the hired help. The ballroom did not understand, not yet. 300 guests watched the groom inexplicably kneel before the shameful prop, and the confusion was total. A great house's heir on his knee before a laborer in a bad suit. And into that confusion I spoke. And I let the prop's voice fall away entirely, and I let the sovereign's voice come, the voice that ruled the city. And I said, "Rise, Julian Thorne. Though I confess I've enjoyed watching you kneel. You spent 2 weeks calling me the prop, the nobody. You threatened me at a bar and sent men to my home. You told me people like me are easy to ruin." I let my eyes sweep the ballroom, 300 of the most powerful people in the city, beginning to understand that something impossible was happening. My name is Leo Sterling, and for those of you who have not had the privilege, which is nearly all of you, allow me to introduce myself properly, since I've spent this entire courtship in disguise. I reached up, a gesture, the unveiling, the costume coming off, not cloth, but the whole concealment of 3 years. I am the sovereign of the founder's court, the throne above the 5 great houses, the authority to which every patriarch in this room has knelt and sworn. The seat that has ruled this city from behind the veil since the founders built it. I have never, in the history of this office, appeared unveiled before the houses. I'm appearing now, here, at this wedding, because House Thorn has done something that requires the sovereign to step out of the shadows, and because I wanted very much to do it in person. The ballroom came apart. I have witnessed a great many reactions in my life, but nothing like the reaction of 300 of the most powerful people in the city realizing all at once that the man they dismissed all evening as a shameful laborer was the sovereign of the founder's court, the apex authority none of them had ever seen, standing in their midst, unveiled, in a suit that didn't fit. I watched the patriarchs of the great houses, the proudest people in the city, recognize the truth and do the thing their world required, the thing bred into them across generations. Across the ballroom, one by one and then all at once, the great houses of the city sank to their knees, the cascade I'd promised you. 300 of the most powerful people in the city kneeling in a thorn ballroom to the hired prop, because the hired prop was the one man they all knelt to, and the recognition rolled across the room like a wave, house after house, knee after knee, until the entire ballroom was on its knees before the loser in the bad suit. I want you to hold that image, because I waited my whole imprisoned life for it without knowing it, and you should get to see it the way I saw it. 300 of the most powerful people in the city, the patriarchs and the matriarchs and the heirs, the people who owned the banks and the towers and the courts, the people who had dismissed me all evening with a single glance, the people whose contempt for the powerless was so total and so reflexive that it had become invisible even to themselves. All of them, on their knees, on a marble floor, before a man in a suit that didn't fit, holding a cheap bouquet. Lady Sinclair, who had called me nothing at all, on her knees, her face white with the horror of remembering it. The patriarchs who had stepped around the prop all evening, on their knees. The heirs who had snickered at the laborer, on their knees. The whole gleaming edifice of the city's contempt collapsed into a single room full of kneeling, because the nothing they had all dismissed had turned out to be the everything they all served. It was not the power of it that moved me, though the power was absolute. It was the lesson of it, made visible, made undeniable, made into a tableau 300 people would never forget. That the man you treat as nothing might be the man you would kneel to, and that you can never, ever be certain. And that the only safe way to move through the world is to treat every nothing as a someone, because the day you guess wrong about which nobody mattered is the day you find yourself, like 300 of the proudest people in the city, on your knees on a marble floor, understanding far too late exactly what you'd been too arrogant to see. They had dismissed the prop, and the prop had been the throne. And now they knelt, and the kneeling was the whole truth of my life, rendered in marble and silk and dawning horror, the truth I'd learned at the bottom and proven at the altar. There is no such thing as a person who doesn't matter, and the powerful forget it at exactly this cost. All except 3 people. Julian, already kneeling, frozen in horror. Arthur Thorne, the patriarch, standing rigid and gray, understanding that his scheme had just walked into the one being in the city it could not survive. And Alara at the front, in her wedding dress, staring at the man she'd hired to be a joke, the man she'd told at a gate that she loved, the nobody, now revealed as the most powerful man in the city, her hand over her mouth, her whole world rearranging. I found Arthur Thorne's eyes across the kneeling ballroom. "Arthur Thorne," I said, "you may remain standing. I want everyone to see you standing, the only patriarch in this room who hasn't knelt, because in about 2 minutes everyone is going to understand exactly why you of all people should be on the floor. You engineered the murder of House Vance. You destroyed the Vance foundry through sabotage and engineered financing collapse. 2 years of patient cruelty to bankrupt a great house and make its heiress desperate. You did it because you learned, before anyone else, that the Vance ancestral land is about to become the most valuable parcel in the city, a crown that would elevate House Thorne above all the houses, perhaps above the court itself. And you arranged this wedding, this marriage of your son to the woman whose family you ruined, for the sole purpose of stealing that crown through the marriage settlement, transferring the Vance land to House Thorne in the moment of the vows." I let the indictment fall into the silent, kneeling ballroom. I have all of it. Every shell entity, every sabotaged contract, every cut financing line, the marriage settlement, the land transfer, the men your son sent last night to threaten a laborer he didn't know was his sovereign. All of it, documented, sealed, undeniable. You murdered a great house to steal a crown, and you used a marriage and a deceived woman to do it. And the entire scheme was the opening move in House Thorne's bid to rise above the court the founders built to keep exactly this from happening. My voice went cold, the full cold of the throne above the thrones. You overreached, Arthur. You forgot that there is a knee even House Thorne must bend. And in your arrogance, you hired that knee, in a bad suit, for $2,000 to stand at your son's wedding. The court has watched House Thorne's ambition for months. Tonight, it ends. Tonight, the sovereign has come out from behind the veil for the first time in the history of the seat to deliver House Thorne's judgment in person. At the wedding, you built your whole cruelty to reach. I turned, finally, to the front of the ballroom, to the woman in the wedding dress, and the cold left my voice entirely, and I spoke to her, and only to her, across the kneeling room. And to free the bride, Ilara Vance, the kindest person in this entire rotten scheme. You hired a shameful fiancé to save your family. You accidentally hired the one man in the city who could actually save it. And you fell in love with the nobody before you knew he was the throne, which is the only reason any of this matters to me at all. So before I finish dismantling House Thorne, I have one question for you, and your answer comes before anything else, because you matter more than the judgment, more than the crown, more than the throne. I looked at the woman I loved, in another man's wedding dress, in a ballroom full of people kneeling to me, and I asked the only question that had ever mattered. You told me at a gate that you loved the man in the bad suit, and that whatever I turned out to be, that's who you loved. And you asked me not to let the truth make you lose the nobody. So I'm asking you, Ilara, in front of everyone, with all my costumes off at last. The man in the bad suit is also the sovereign of the Founder's Court, and he is exactly as in love with you as he was on that staff room floor, and he would burn down every great house in this city before he'd let you marry a snake who ruined your family. Do you still want the nobody, now that you know what he comes with? Because the nobody still wants you, more than the throne, more than anything, and he always will. Ilara Vance looked at me across the kneeling ballroom, in her wedding dress, the bride who had just learned that the nobody she loved was the throne above the thrones. And for a moment, the whole city held its breath, because the answer to my question was the only thing in that room that mattered to me, more than the judgment, more than the crown, more than 300 patriarchs on their knees. And then Ilara did the thing that told me, one final time, that I'd chosen right, that the woman on the staff room floor was exactly who I'd believed her to be. She didn't curtsy, she didn't kneel, she didn't perform awe at the sovereign the way 300 powerful people were performing it all around her. She walked, in her wedding dress, across the ballroom, past her kneeling family and the kneeling houses and the frozen Croutons, straight to me, the man in the bad suit, and she stopped in front of me, and she looked at me with tears streaming down her face, and she said, loud enough for the whole room to hear, "I don't care what you come with. I told you at the gate. I fell in love with the man who asked if I was okay, the man who saw me, the man in the bad suit who treated a server on a floor of broken glass like she mattered when he thought no one important was watching." She took my hands, the way she'd straightened my collar 2 weeks before. "I don't want the sovereign. I mean, I'll take him. Apparently he comes with you, and that's fine. But I want the nobody. I want Leo. I wanted him when I thought he had nothing, and I want him now that I know he has everything. And the having everything doesn't change a single thing about why I love him. Because I never loved him for what he had. I loved him for what he saw. So yes, 1,000 times yes. I still want the nobody. I'll always want the nobody. Now please, for the love of God, get me out of this dress, because I am not marrying Julian Thorne. I am never marrying Julian Thorne, and I would very much like to stop standing at his altar." And the most powerful man in the city laughed, in a kneeling ballroom, with relief and joy, and pulled the woman he loved into his arms, the bride and the prop, the heiress and the nobody, the only two people in that room who'd ever loved each other for the right reasons. And 300 of the most powerful people in the city watched the sovereign of the Founder's Court hold a fallen heiress in another man's wedding dress, and understood that they were witnessing not just the fall of a great house, but the strangest and truest love story their world had ever produced. She loved the nobody. She'd loved him when he had nothing. And the nobody had turned out to be everything. And it hadn't changed her love by a single degree, because her love had never been about the everything in the first place. It was the thing my throne had told me was impossible, and Ilara Vance had made it real, on a staff room floor, for a man in a bad suit, and I would spend the rest of my life grateful that a bored god had answered an ad for $2,000. Then I let her go, gently, and I turned back to the business of the evening, which was the destruction of House Thorn, because love is love, and justice is justice, and a sovereign delivers both. Arthur Thorn, I said, here is the judgment of the Founders' Court, delivered in person, for the first time in the history of the seat, because your crime was large enough to bring the throne out from behind the veil. House Thorn murdered House Vance. You will undo it. Every asset stripped from the Vance foundry through your sabotage will be restored, with interest, from House Thorn's holdings. The Vance ancestral land remains in full with House Vance, and the marriage settlement that would have transferred it is void, as is this entire fraudulent wedding. And the crown that land is about to become, the value the new development will create, will belong to House Vance, the family you tried to murder for it, which means that by sunrise, the house you brought low will be elevated above the house that brought it low. And you, Arthur, will spend the rest of your life watching the family you tried to destroy rise on the very crown you murdered them to steal. That is the court's justice. Poetic, I think. The Founders would have approved. Arthur Thorn, the lion of House Thorn, finally broke, the gray, rigid patriarch sinking at last to his knees, not in the reflexive recognition of the houses, but in the collapse of a man whose entire scheme, his whole patient cruelty, his bid for the city, had just been turned completely against him in front of everyone. Sovereign, he said, his voice cracking. Please, House Thorn has served the court for generations. I overreached, I admit it, but to strip us, to elevate the Lockwoods on our crime, it will ruin us. It will end House Thorn's standing forever. House Thorn's standing ended the moment you decided to murder a great house and rise against the court, I said without mercy, because some things have earned the absence of mercy. You're not being ruined, Arthur. You're being corrected. House Thorn will survive, diminished, humbled, stripped of the gains of your cruelty, returned to its proper place beneath the throne it forgot it had to kneel to. That's mercy, actually. More mercy than you showed House Vance, who you tried to erase entirely. Be grateful for the difference between correction and erasure. It's the difference between how the court rules and how you scheme. Now, kneel properly and stay kneeling while I deal with your son. And then I turned to Julian Thorn, still on his knee, the snake who'd called me the prop, who'd threatened the laborer, who'd married a woman his family ruined to steal her family's crown and felt nothing but cold satisfaction at the scheme. Julian, you're a particular kind of small. Your father at least had a vision, a cruel and overreaching one, but a vision, a bid for the city. You just wanted the prize, and you were willing to deceive a kind woman, threaten a laborer, and send men in the night to get it. You told me people like me are easy to ruin. Let me show you how it's actually done, by someone who knows. I let the cold settle. You're disinherited from any role in House Thorn's affairs by my decree, because a house under correction cannot afford an heir as morally bankrupt as you. You'll face the law for the men you sent last night, documented and ready, because threatening violence against a citizen is a crime even an heir answers for. And you'll spend the rest of your life as the man who knelt to the hired prop at his own wedding, the cautionary tale every house will tell its children, the heir so blinded by his own contempt for the powerless that he threatened, dismissed, and tried to remove the most powerful man in the city because he couldn't conceive that the nobody might be someone. That's your ruin, Julian, not poverty. Story. You'll be the punchline of this city for a generation, and you'll have earned every telling. I looked at him, the snake brought low. You should have been kind to the prop, Julian, not because he might have been the sovereign, because he was a person, and that should have been enough. The fact that you needed him to be powerful before you'd treat him with basic decency is the whole reason you've lost everything tonight. Remember that, in the long years ahead. The man you treat as nothing might be the man who decides your entire future. But more than that, the man you treat as nothing is a man, and a person who can't see that should never be trusted with power over anyone. You never could see it, so you'll never have power again. Rise and go, and live with what you are. And House Thorn's heir rose, ruined, and walked out of his own wedding through a ballroom of people who'd watched him kneel to the prop. And the snake's long con ended exactly as the cruel schemes always end, in the cold daylight of the truth becoming visible, with nothing left to spin and nowhere left to run. I turned last to House Vance, to Evelyn and Edward and the fated family that had been so horrified by the shameful fiancé, and I watched them understand, slowly, that the loser they'd looked down on, the embarrassment, the symbol of their fall, was the sovereign of the founder's court, and that he had just restored their murdered fortune, returned their ancestral land, and elevated their fallen house above the house that brought it low. Edward Vance, the proud, rigid uncle who'd been coldest to the prop, came forward ashen and began to stammer an apology, a mortified account of how he'd treated me, how he'd looked down on me, how he hadn't known. And I stopped him, gently, because Edward Vance's cruelty had been the cruelty of a frightened, drowning man, not a snake, and because the test the universe had handed him, how he treated the powerless, was a test he'd failed but not damnably, the way most people fail it, out of fear rather than malice. "Edward," I said, "you don't owe me an apology, though I'll accept that you've learned something. You treated the shameful fiancé with contempt because you were terrified, because your house was drowning and the prop was the symbol of your fall. That's a human failure, not an evil one, and I'll tell you how to atone for it, the only way that matters. Your house is about to rise. You're about to have power again, real power, the crown land, the restored fortune, House Vance elevated above the houses. And the thing I want you to carry, the only payment I'll ever ask, is this. Remember how it felt to be the fallen one, the dismissed one, the family everyone looked down on. Remember the shameful fiancé you were so cruel to. And when House Vance is powerful again, be the house that treats the powerless with dignity, that's kind to the props and the nobodies and the people who can do nothing for you. Because you know now, you know in your bones, that the dismissed nobody might be the most important person in the room. And more than that the dismissed nobody is a person, and that's reason enough. Raise House Vance back up, and raise it up as a house that remembers the bottom. That's how you atone. That's the only payment I want. Do that and we're square, and House Vance has the court's full blessing." And Edward Vance, weeping now, the proud man humbled and forgiven and given away to be better, knelt properly, gratefully, and pledged it. And I believed him, because the universe had finally taught him, the hard way, the only lesson that ever matters. And Alara came back to my side, out of the wedding dress now, in a simple coat someone had found her, the heiress who'd chosen the nobody, and she slipped her hand into mine, the prop and the bride, and she looked out at the ballroom, House Thorne fallen, House Vance restored, the great houses still kneeling, the throne unveiled, and she said softly, just to me, "I hired you to ruin my wedding so I could marry the wrong man, and you ruined my wedding so I wouldn't have to. Best $2,000 I ever spent." And the most powerful man in the city laughed, holding the hand of the only person who'd ever loved him for himself, in the wreckage of the cruelest scheme in the city, and thought that a bored god answering an ad had turned out to be the wisest thing he'd ever done. The city did not recover quickly from the wedding, and watching it reckon with what had happened was its own kind of education, because the unveiling of the sovereign at a Thorne wedding sent a shock through every great house and every powerful person in the city. And the shock did something I hadn't fully anticipated but came to deeply appreciate. It made the entire ruling class of the city afraid, all at once, of the people they'd been dismissing their whole lives. Because here is what every powerful person in that city understood, in the days after the wedding, the thought that kept them awake. The sovereign had been among them, unseen, as the lowest man in the room. The throne above the thrones had spent weeks being looked down on, mocked, dismissed, threatened, by people who had no idea who he was. And if the sovereign could be the shameful prop at a wedding, then who else might the dismissed nobody be? The waiter who'd been snapped at, the driver who'd been ignored, the cleaner who'd been stepped around, the poor relation who'd been mocked. Suddenly, every powerful person in the city was forced to confront the possibility that the people they'd been treating as nothing might be someone, might be watching, might be the very authority they'd kneel to, and the possibility terrified them, and the terror did something the court's decrees never could. It made the powerful of the city, for the first time in generations, genuinely careful about how they treated the powerless. I'd be lying if I said I engineered that effect on purpose. I unveiled at the wedding to save Alara and destroy House Thorne, not to reform the manners of the ruling class. But the reform was the most valuable thing that came out of it, more lasting than the fall of one house or the rise of another, because the city's whole power structure shifted, just slightly, just enough, toward the recognition that the dismissed nobody might be anyone, and that you'd be wise to treat everyone with dignity because you can never be sure who you're actually talking to. It was the lesson I'd built my life around, made suddenly real and urgent for the entire ruling class because the sovereign had proven it the hard way, at a wedding, by being the nobody they'd all dismissed. Lady Sinclair came to me after. The fearsome old matriarch who'd interrogated the prop at the garden luncheon, who'd called me nothing at all in front of an audience, who'd said she'd met more impressive footmen. She came to the court, terrified, having spent the days since the wedding remembering in cold horror every word she'd said to the loser who'd turned out to be her sovereign. And she knelt, the proud, terrible old woman, and she began to stammer the apology she'd been rehearsing in dread. And I let her get partway through it, not out of cruelty, but because Lady Sinclair needed to feel the full weight of the lesson. And then I stopped her, and I gave her the same thing I'd given Edward Vance, the only payment I ever ask. Lady Sinclair, I said, you called me nothing at all. You said you'd met more impressive footmen. And I told you at the time that the people who actually matter never seem to need to remind everyone how impressive they are, and that I'd rather be insignificant and notice the kindness of others than be impressive and miss it. Do you remember? She did. I could see her remembering, the words she'd dismissed now ringing in her ears with a terrible new weight. I wasn't saying it to threaten you. I didn't know that afternoon that I'd ever unveil. I was saying it because it was true, and because some part of me hoped that even a woman as certain as you might hear it. You didn't then. You're hearing it now. But you're hearing it because you're afraid, because the nothing turned out to be the sovereign, and that's the wrong reason, the Julian reason, the reason that's about power instead of decency. I leaned forward. So here is what I want from you, the only payment, the only way to atone for the footman remark. I want you to go back into the city, and I want you to treat the next nothing you meet, the next footman, the next waiter, the next dismissed nobody, exactly the way you'd treat me. Not because they might be the sovereign. They won't be. I'm the only sovereign, and I'm taken. Treat them with dignity because they're people, and because you've now felt, in your own bones, the horror of having dismissed a person who mattered, and because that horror should teach you the thing I tried to tell you at the luncheon, which is that everyone matters, that there's no such thing as a nothing, that the footman you'd dismiss is exactly as human as the sovereign you'd kneel to. Learn that. Really learn it. Not from fear, but from understanding. And treat every nobody you meet for the rest of your life as if they were someone, and we're square. That's the whole payment. Now rise, and go be better, and stop calling people nothing, because you never know who they are, and more importantly, it never matters who they are, because they're always someone. Lady Sinclair rose, shaken and, I think, genuinely changed, the way fear can sometimes crack a person open to a truth they'd spent a lifetime refusing. And she went back into the city, and I'm told, by the people who watch such things, that Lady Sinclair became, in her last years, unaccountably, famously kind to servants and strangers and the dismissed, a transformation the city found baffling, and that only she and I understood. She'd met the nothing, and the nothing had been the throne, and the meeting had taught her the lesson at last, and she spent what was left of her life living it, which is the most anyone can do, and more than most ever manage. That happened, in various forms, across the city in the months after the wedding. The powerful, terrified that the next nobody might be someone, became careful, and the carefulness, even when it started from fear, sometimes deepened, in the better ones, into the actual understanding, the real lesson, that everyone matters, and the city became, by small degrees, a slightly kinder place to be powerless in, because its rulers had been forced to confront, all at once, at a wedding, the possibility that the people beneath them might be anyone, and the deeper truth beneath that possibility, that the people beneath them were always, already, someone. And House Vance, rising, led the way I'd asked Edward to lead it, the house that remembered the bottom, the house that treated the powerless with dignity not from fear, but from memory. And the example of House Vance, the kindest great house, thriving precisely because of its kindness, did more to reform the city than any decree the court could issue, because it proved the thing the powerful most needed to see, that dignity toward the powerless wasn't weakness but strength, that the house which treated everyone as someone was the house everyone wanted to work for and ally with and follow, and that the whole cruel arithmetic the great houses had run for generations, the dismissal of the nobody, the contempt for the powerless, had been not just morally wrong, but strategically stupid, a squandering of the loyalty and the talent and the truth that only flow to those who treat people as people. I watched all of it from behind the veil, mostly, the city reforming itself in the long shadow of a wedding, and I felt something I hadn't felt in 3 years of ruling, that the seat was doing what the founders built it to do, not just keeping the houses from devouring each other, but, through the strange accident of a sovereign who'd gone to the bottom and been dismissed and unveiled at a wedding, teaching the whole ruling class the one lesson that actually makes power bearable, the lesson that there's no such thing as a person who doesn't matter. The founders had veiled the seat to protect the city from the houses. I'd unveiled it, once, at a wedding, for love, and the unveiling had protected the city from something deeper, the contempt of the powerful for the powerless, the disease that had rotted House Thorne and nearly murdered House Vance, and that ran, untreated, through the whole ruling class. One wedding, one unveiling, one prop in a bad suit turning out to be the throne, and a city that would, for a generation at least, remember to be careful with the nobody, because the nobody might be anyone, and was always someone. It was the best thing I ever did as sovereign, and I did it by accident, going to the bottom for love, the way I'd gone to the bottom for survival, the way I'd always gone to the bottom for the truth. The bottom, it turns out, is where you save not just yourself, but the whole city, because the bottom is where the truth lives, and the truth, finally made visible at a wedding, was the only medicine the sick, proud city had ever really needed. Everyone matters. There's no such thing as a nothing. Treat the prop like a person. You never know who he is, and it never matters who he is, because he's always someone. And the day the powerful remember that is the day the city is finally worth ruling. A year later, I can tell you how it all settled, because the settling is where a story stops being a triumph and becomes a life. And the life I built after that wedding is the only thing I've ever been truly proud of. More than the throne, more than the destruction of House Thorne, more than any of it. House Vance rose. The crown land became exactly what House Thorne had murdered to obtain, the most valuable parcel in the city, and it belonged in full to the family House Thorne had tried to erase. And within a year, House Vance had risen from the fallen house, the cautionary tale, to the ascendant house, the great story of the city's reordering. And House Vance rose the way I'd ask Edward to make it rise, as a house that remembered the bottom, that treated its workers and its servants and its nobodies with a dignity the other houses had to scramble to match, because the head of House Vance had stood at the bottom and looked up at a sovereign in a bad suit and learned in his bones that the dismissed nobody might be anyone and is always someone. Edward kept his pledge. House Vance became the kindest of the great houses, and the kindness, far from weakening it, made it the one every talented person wanted to work for, the one the loyal flocked to. And within a year, the kindness was the most powerful competitive advantage in the city, because it turns out, as I'd learned in another life behind a veil, that treating people as people is not weakness, but the deepest strength there is. And House Vance, raised on that lesson, thrived. House Thorne survived, diminished, corrected, returned to its proper place beneath the throne, and Arthur Thorne lived out his years as the patriarch who'd overreached and been humbled, watching the family he'd tried to murder rise on the crown he'd schemed to steal, which was, as I'd told him, a more poetic justice than ruin. And Julian became exactly what I'd promised, the cautionary tale, the heir who knelt to the prop. The punchline, a generation of the city's children would be told to keep them humble. The man whose name became a synonym for the specific stupidity of mistaking the powerless for the worthless. He faced the law for the men he'd sent, and he served his correction, and he emerged into a world where his name was a joke. And he lives now, I'm told, quietly and far away. A small, ruined man who once had everything and lost it all, because he couldn't conceive that the nobody in the bad suit might be someone. I don't think about Julian much. He's the pure, distilled example of the thing my whole life had taught me to watch for, and watching it destroy him so completely was its own kind of lesson, delivered to the whole city. Be kind to the prop. Not because he might be the sovereign, but because he's a person, and the ones who need him to be powerful before they'll be decent are the ones who always, eventually, fall. And House Thorne's bid against the court, the overreach, the threat to the balance the founders built the seat to protect, ended completely. And the lesson it taught the other houses, that the throne above the thrones was real, was watching, and would, if pushed far enough, come out from behind the veil in person to deliver judgment, kept the great houses in their proper place for a generation. The court was strengthened by my unveiling, not weakened, because the houses had glimpsed the thing they'd half forgotten in their pride, that there was a sovereign, that he saw everything, that he could appear anywhere, even at a wedding, even in a bad suit, and that the knee they kept in reserve was kept in reserve for a reason. I went back behind the veil after the wedding mostly, the sovereign resumed, but the city ruled a little better for having been reminded once that the throne was real, and the throne was watching, and the throne would, for the right reasons, walk among them unseen. But the real settling, the thing that mattered, was Elara. We married, of course, though not the way you'd expect, not in a grand ballroom with 300 guests. We married quietly, the heiress and the nobody, in a small ceremony with only the people who'd loved us for ourselves. Elara's mother, Edward, Cale, a handful of others, and I wore a suit that fit, finally, and Elara wore a dress she chose for joy instead of strategy, and we married not as the sovereign and the heiress of House Vance, though we were those things, but as Leo and Elara, the man who asked if she was okay, and the woman who knelt on staff room floors, the two people who'd found, against every impossibility, the one thing my throne had told me could never exist. Love that came before the power, love for the man instead of the seat, love that the truth of who I was hadn't changed by a single degree. That's the thing I'm proudest of in the end. Not that I destroyed a great house, though I did. Not that I saved a fallen one, though I did. Not that I ruled the city well, though I tried to. The thing I'm proudest of is that a bored, isolated, imprisoned God, drowning behind a veil, dying of the loneliness of absolute power, answered an ad for $2,000 to play a loser, and in playing the loser found the one thing his power had cost him and could never buy back. A person who loved the man and not the throne, who'd loved him when he had nothing, who would have loved him forever if he'd really been the nobody he pretended to be. Elara gave me back the thing my seat had taken, the experience of being loved for myself, and there is no power in the city, no crown, no throne, no absolute authority that I would not trade for that. And the miracle of my life is that I didn't have to trade anything, that I got to keep the throne and the love both, because the woman who loved the nobody was generous enough to take the sovereign too, as a kind of bonus, a thing the nobody happened to come with. People ask me, the very few who know the whole story, whether I regret the disguise, the deception, the 2 weeks of letting Elara love a man she thought was poor. And I tell them the truth, which is complicated. I regret the deception, in the sense that I'd never want Elara to have felt, even for a moment, that she'd been made a fool of, that her love had been a kind of foolishness, that she was the only one in the room who didn't know. And the thing I'm most grateful for is that the reveal, the way I did it, at the wedding, in front of everyone, with my question to her coming before anything else, before the judgment, before the crown, honored her love instead of humiliating it. I made sure, when the costume came off, that the first thing that happened was me asking her, publicly, whether she still wanted the nobody, putting her choice and her dignity above the whole spectacle of the throne. Because the deception was real, but the love was realer, and I would not let the deception poison the love, and it didn't, because Elara understood, the way she understood everything, that the man in the bad suit had been the truest part of me all along, that the disguise hadn't been a lie about who I was, but a way of finally being who I was, free of the throne, seen for myself, and that she'd loved the realest version of me there was. The nobody wasn't the disguise. The sovereign was the disguise. The nobody, the man who asked if she was okay, was who I actually am, underneath the seat and the veil and the absolute power. And Elara had loved exactly that, the real thing, and the reveal didn't change it because there was nothing to change. There is one more thing I want to tell you about Alara, because it's the truest thing, and it's the reason all of it worked. After the wedding, after the unveiling, after she'd learned that the nobody she loved was the sovereign of the city, I asked her, one quiet evening, whether she'd ever suspected. Whether some part of her had guessed, in those 2 weeks, that the man in the bad suit was more than he seemed, and whether that suspicion was part of why she'd let herself love him. And Alara looked at me, and she laughed, gently, and she said, "Leo, I'm going to tell you something and I need you to actually hear it, because I think it's the thing you most need to know. After 3 years of being a god no one could love. I never suspected you were the sovereign. Not once. I thought you were a poor man in a bad suit, all the way to the wedding. And I loved you anyway. I loved you because you asked if I was okay when no one else did. I loved you because you saw me kneel on a staff room floor and thought it was the most impressive thing at the party, when everyone else thought the most impressive thing was Julian's watch. I loved you when I thought loving you meant throwing away my family's salvation for a nobody, when there was nothing in it for me but you, when you were, as far as I knew, the worst possible choice I could make. That's the love I want you to hold on to, the next time the throne makes you feel like no one will ever love the man. I loved the man so much I was ready to lose everything for him, when the man was nothing at all. The throne was a surprise. A nice one. But it was never why. You need to know that it was never why, because you've spent 3 years believing no one could ever love you for yourself, and I'm the proof you were wrong, and I'm going to be the proof every day for the rest of our lives. And the most powerful man in the city wept, then, in front of the woman who'd loved the nobody, because she'd given him, in a few sentences, the thing his absolute power had spent 3 years telling him he could never have. The certain knowledge that he was loved for himself, completely, when he was nothing, which is the only love that was ever real, and the only one a god can never command, and the one I'd somehow impossibly found in a bad suit at a fallen house for $2,000, because I'd gone to the bottom, as always, simply to remember what it was to be real, and found there the only thing that ever made me so. I still slip the veil sometimes, still go among the city as no one, still ride the trains and eat in the diners and let strangers be honest with me and indifferent to me, because the medicine for being a god is still being a man, and I'll need it as long as I hold the seat. But I don't go alone anymore. Alara comes with me, the heiress and the sovereign slumming it as 2 nobodies in the city they secretly rule, and it's the best part of every week, the 2 of us. No thrones, no houses, no power. Just Leo and Alara. A man and a woman in ordinary clothes, seeing the city from the bottom, the only place you can ever really see it, the only place either of us ever feels fully real. A woman hired me to play her shameful, penniless fiancé so her family would bless her marriage to a great house's heir. I took the job for $2,000 and a suit that didn't fit. And at the wedding, the heir of House Thorn turned to look at the loser he was about to replace and dropped to his knee. Because in his world, you kneel before only one man, and that man had shown up to the wedding as the hired help. But the kneel was never the point. The kneel was just the spectacle, the dopamine, the satisfying fall of a snake who'd dismissed the prop. The point was the thing underneath it, the thing the whole story was actually about, the thing I'd learned at the bottom and proven at the altar. That there is no such thing as a person who doesn't matter. That the loser in the bad suit might be the sovereign of the city, or he might just be a man, and either way you owe him the same thing, which is to see him, to treat him with dignity, to remember that the dismissed nobody is a person. And that's enough. That was always enough. Julian Thorne needed the nobody to be powerful before he'd treat him with decency, and it cost him everything. Alara Vance treated the nobody with decency when she thought he had nothing, and it gave her everything. The crown, the freedom, the saved family, and the man who turned out to be the throne above the thrones, who'd have burned the whole city down before he'd let her marry a snake, and who loves her, still, more than the seat, more than the power, more than anything, the way he has since a staff room floor and a stack of broken glass. She spent $2,000 to hire a loser. She got the most powerful man in the city who loved her for herself, who saved her family, who freed her from a snake, and who would, every single day for the rest of their lives, choose to be the nobody in the bad suit, because the nobody was the realest thing he ever was, and the woman who loved him chose the nobody too. Best $2,000 either of us ever spent. And the only money that ever bought a god his soul back.